She was 24, a nursing assistant, full of life and plans for the future. A night out at local bars with friends felt safe, ordinary, until a man approached her. Well-dressed, charming, the kind of stranger who seems harmless at first glance. But beneath that mask was something far darker. Days later, her body was found on a rural road in Connecticut, engulfed in flames, wrapped in plastic, bound in duct tape, mutilated so viciously that her identity was nearly erased. Her nose, her ears, her fingers, even her tattoos cut away. This wasn't just murder. This was control, cruelty, and a desperate attempt to silence her forever. How does someone smile at you one night and then strip you of your very existence the next? This is the disturbing case of Rebecca Coster. In the quiet rural community of Stonington, Connecticut, rolling hills and dense forests created a peaceful New England atmosphere. Quaint villages dotted the landscape, connected by winding country roads that grew pitch black after sunset. It was the kind of place where nothing terrible was supposed to happen. On this particular evening, a driver making his way down one of these isolated roads noticed bright flames ahead. Thinking he had stumbled upon a simple brush fire, he pulled over and immediately called 911. As he grabbed his fire extinguisher from his vehicle, a local fire chief arrived on the scene with his own equipment. Together, they began working to put out the blaze. But as the flames died down, the fire chief realized this was no ordinary fire. What lay burning before them appeared to be human remains. The moment became a turning point. This was now a crime scene. Instead of spraying the extinguisher directly at the body, the fire chief angled it upward, letting the chemicals fall gently to preserve whatever evidence might remain. Connecticut State Police quickly arrived and secured the area. They blocked off the road and began their careful examination of the scene. Every detail mattered now: how the body was positioned, what materials surrounded it, and any clues that might help identify the victim or the person responsible. The victim's body was burned beyond recognition and wrapped in multiple layers of plastic bags, blankets, sheets, and duct tape. The meticulous wrapping made it clear that someone had taken great care in concealing the remains. This was obviously a dump site. The person had been killed elsewhere and brought here to be disposed of. Dr. Ira Kaner, the Connecticut State Medical Examiner, would be called upon to unravel this mystery. When the wrapped body arrived at his facility, Dr. Kaner began the painstaking process of examination. The remains were encased in multiple layers that had to be removed with extreme care. Each layer might contain crucial evidence: fingerprints, DNA, or other clues that could lead investigators to the killer. As Dr. Kaner unwrapped the body, he discovered it belonged to a young woman, probably in her 20s. Her ethnicity was difficult to determine due to the burning, but she appeared to be either light-skinned black or possibly Latina. What struck him most was the deliberate mutilation. Her nose, ears, fingers, and toes had all been removed. Even a section of skin from her ankle had been cut away. The pattern was clear. Someone had systematically removed every feature that could be used to identify this woman. Without fingerprints or distinctive physical characteristics, determining who she was would be nearly impossible. This level of mutilation suggested the killer had planned carefully to prevent identification. Dr. Kaner noticed that the front of the body was more severely burned than the back. This told him the woman had been lying on her back when she was set on fire. The area of her lower back that had been pressed against the ground was better preserved. In this protected area, he could see where a large section of skin had been deliberately cut away. The precision of the cut suggested it had been done to remove a tattoo, likely a large, distinctive one that could have helped identify her. Connecticut detectives immediately began searching their database for missing women who matched the victim's description, particularly focusing on those with large back tattoos. Their search came up empty. Expanding their investigation to neighboring states, they finally found a potential match. 80 miles away on Long Island, New York, a 24-year-old nursing assistant named Rebecca Coster had been reported missing. Rebecca lived at home with her parents, and her stepfather, Larry Ross, had filed the missing person report after her employer called to say she hadn't shown up for work. She had been out with friends the previous night and hadn't been seen since 3:30 in the morning. The missing person flyer included photographs of Rebecca, along with details about her height, weight, and hair color. Most importantly, it mentioned a specific identifying feature: a large butterfly tattoo on her lower back. The similarities between the missing woman and the unidentified victim were striking, but investigators needed more evidence to make a positive identification. Despite the apparent connections, Connecticut detectives remained doubtful about whether they truly had a match. The distance between the crime scene and Rebecca's home seemed too great for a simple coincidence. They needed Dr. Kaner to provide definitive proof, and fortunately, the killer had made one crucial mistake. In their attempt to completely erase the victim's identity, the perpetrator had overlooked something vital. They had left the teeth intact. Dr. Kaner knew that dental records provided one of the most reliable methods of identification available to forensic science. Even when teeth are missing, the jaw itself contains unique markers that can be compared to existing dental records by a qualified radiologist. The investigation team contacted Rebecca's family to request access to her dental records. Long Island police personally delivered the records to Dr. Kaner's office. After careful comparison between the victim's teeth and Rebecca's dental history, Dr. Kaner made the confirmation that would change everything. The match was perfect, as reliable as fingerprint identification. The burned remains found on that Connecticut roadside belonged to Rebecca Coster of Long Island. The investigation began in earnest with interviews of Rebecca's family and friends. Detectives needed to create a detailed timeline of Rebecca's final day, tracking her movements and interactions leading up to her disappearance. Rebecca, known as Becky to her loved ones, had been 24 years old at the time of her death. She was a beautiful young woman who bore a striking resemblance to her mother, and the two shared an exceptionally close relationship. Following in her mother's footsteps, Rebecca had trained as a nursing assistant and found fulfilling work providing home care for developmentally disabled adults. Seeing her daughter happy and successful in this career made Barbara feel proud of the job she had done as a mother. Rebecca was known for her bubbly, vibrant personality. Like many people her age, she enjoyed socializing and going out with friends. She had a natural warmth that drew people to her, and she genuinely enjoyed having a good time. On the night Rebecca disappeared, Barbara had been scheduled to work an overnight shift at the hospital. Barbara's last memory of her daughter was a perfectly ordinary moment. Rebecca playfully bothering her younger brother, trying to steal French fries from his plate. Rebecca had told her mother about her plans for the evening. She was going out with her best friend Nicole and her boyfriend Dan to their favorite hangout spot. The plan was simple: spend some time with friends, then come home to get some sleep before work the next morning. Dan was Rebecca's current boyfriend, but their relationship was still new and casual. They had only recently started dating, and it wasn't a serious or long-term commitment. Barbara didn't know Dan well, though he seemed genuine in his feelings for Rebecca and appeared to be a decent person. Rebecca had mentioned that they sometimes had minor disagreements, but Barbara didn't see any major red flags in the relationship. As far as Barbara knew, Rebecca had followed through on her plans exactly as discussed. She had gone out with her friends and returned home safely, even texting her mother around 3:30 in the morning to let her know she had arrived home and was going to bed. This was typical behavior for Rebecca. She always kept her mother informed of her whereabouts and safety. The next morning, while Barbara was finishing her hospital shift, her husband called with alarming news. Rebecca's employer had contacted them because she hadn't shown up for work. Barbara immediately tried calling her daughter but got no answer. She left a message and tried again, but still no response. This was completely unlike Rebecca, who always stayed in communication with her mother and never missed work without calling. When Barbara rushed home to check on her daughter, she found Rebecca's car in the driveway but no sign of Rebecca herself. Worried and confused, Barbara contacted Nicole to see if she knew where Rebecca might be. Nicole explained that she had left early the previous night, leaving Rebecca with Dan and some other friends. She had no idea where Rebecca could be now. This information immediately focused investigators' attention on Dan. In missing person cases, the last person known to have been with the victim automatically becomes a person of interest. When that person is also romantically involved with the victim, they become an even stronger suspect. detectives tracked down Dan and brought him to the police station for questioning. According to his account, he and the group had dropped Rebecca off at her home at 3:30 in the morning. Dan claimed he had walked her to the front door, made sure she got inside safely, and then left with the others. He insisted this was the last time he had seen or spoken to her. Dan seemed genuinely distressed by Rebecca's disappearance and repeatedly proclaimed his innocence. He swore he loved Rebecca and would never do anything to hurt her. To help clear his name, detectives suggested he take a polygraph test. Polygraph examinations are commonly used as investigative tools to help determine if someone might be hiding information or feeling guilty about something. While the results aren't admissible in court and aren't completely reliable, they can provide investigators with useful insights during the questioning process. Dan agreed to take the polygraph test. The examination focused on whether he had any knowledge of Rebecca's whereabouts or the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. When the results came back, they indicated that Dan was being untruthful in his responses. Despite these concerning results, investigators weren't entirely convinced that Dan was responsible for Rebecca's murder. Polygraph tests, while useful, are not foolproof and can sometimes produce false readings. More importantly, Dan had been completely cooperative throughout the investigation, willingly answering questions and submitting to testing. The police conducted a thorough search of Dan's home from top to bottom, looking for any evidence that Rebecca had ever been there. They found nothing suspicious, no signs that she had visited, no traces of violence, and no red flags that would suggest Dan was involved in her disappearance. Investigators worked carefully to verify everyone's account of that night. They spoke with all the friends who had been out with Rebecca and Dan, comparing their stories for consistency. Every person they interviewed told the same story, and all the details matched perfectly. Dan's version of events lined up exactly with what the other witnesses remembered. Without any physical evidence connecting Dan to Rebecca's murder, detectives realized they needed to expand their investigation beyond him. They had to consider other possibilities and look for different suspects who might have been involved in her death. Dr. Kaner focused on determining when Rebecca had died, which could provide crucial information about the timeline of events. He knew that Rebecca had been drinking at a bar earlier that evening, and in healthy people, the body typically processes about 1 alcoholic drink per hour. During the autopsy, Dr. Kaner took samples to test for both drugs and alcohol in Rebecca's system. The results were significant. Both the alcohol and drug tests came back completely negative. This was important because when a person dies, their metabolism stops immediately. Since there was no alcohol left in her system, Dr. Kaner could conclude that Rebecca had been alive for several hours after leaving the bar, giving her body time to process the alcohol she had consumed earlier. Based on this information, Dr. Kaner estimated that Rebecca had died approximately 4 hours after she was last seen alive. However, he was careful to note that determining time of death was not an exact science, and his estimate was his best professional guess based on the available evidence. Given this estimated timeline, investigators needed to determine whether Rebecca had spoken to anyone after Dan dropped her off at 3:30 in the morning. Rebecca's family was able to access her phone records through their computer, hoping to identify the last person who had contacted her. What they discovered was deeply troubling. The phone records showed 2 incoming calls to Rebecca's phone in the early morning hours, both from the same number with a 617 area code. The first call came in at 4:10 in the morning, and the second at 4:27. It seemed clear that whoever made these calls was likely the last person to speak with Rebecca before her death. Detectives began to suspect that the person who called Rebecca at 4:27 in the morning was probably her killer. This phone contact represented a crucial breakthrough in understanding what had happened during Rebecca's final hours. Rebecca's mother would later reflect on her daughter's trusting nature, which may have contributed to the tragedy. Like many young women, Rebecca had made what turned out to be a fatal decision to trust someone she shouldn't have. She never believed that anyone would actually want to hurt her, despite her mother's warnings. Her mother had often told Rebecca that her beauty made her a target, saying that there were dangerous people in the world who looked just like everyone else but had evil intentions. Police immediately began working to trace the source of those 2 mysterious phone calls made to Rebecca on the morning of her murder. They were able to quickly obtain the phone records for the number that had been contacting her. While investigators continued trying to identify the mysterious caller, Dr. Kaner worked on determining exactly how Rebecca had died. When examining burned remains, one of the first questions forensic pathologists must answer is whether the victim was still alive when the fire started. The severe burning made it difficult to identify external injuries on Rebecca's skin, so Dr. Kaner focused his examination on the internal organs, the heart, liver, lungs, and kidneys. During this internal examination, he made a disturbing discovery. Rebecca had suffered a stab wound to her liver, and there were several hundred cubic centimeters of fluid and clotted blood in her abdominal cavity. This indicated a serious injury to the liver that had caused significant internal bleeding. He also found 4 sharp force injuries to her neck. Because Rebecca had suffered multiple fatal wounds, Dr. Kaner listed the official cause of death as the result of all the injuries combined. The case was definitely a homicide. Someone had deliberately attacked Rebecca with a knife, inflicting multiple stab wounds to both her neck and liver. These wounds had killed her before her body was mutilated and burned. Now armed with the official cause of death, police returned to investigating Rebecca's final movements. Through their interviews with people who had been with Rebecca that night, they learned that the group had visited a bar called Butcher Boy. Investigators quickly discovered that this establishment had a surveillance system, and they were able to obtain all the security footage from the night Rebecca was there. When detectives reviewed the video footage, they could clearly see Rebecca inside the bar. What caught their attention was that she appeared to be sitting alone much of the time, while her boyfriend and friends were off talking to other people in different areas of the bar. During this time, the cameras captured something significant: an unknown man approaching Rebecca. This man appeared to be older than the typical bar crowd, certainly not in his early 20s like most of the other patrons. He was dressed conservatively, wearing what looked like a sweater vest, giving him an unassuming and harmless appearance. The video showed him entering Rebecca's personal space quickly and engaging her in conversation for an extended period. What made the footage particularly interesting was that both Rebecca and this stranger could be seen using their phones while talking. It appeared they were exchanging some kind of information, and at one point, the man seemed to take Rebecca's phone from her hands and punch in a number. This suggested they might have been exchanging contact information. Based on this new evidence from the surveillance footage, investigators decided to re-interview the people who had been with Rebecca that night. During these follow-up conversations, a woman named Jennifer suddenly remembered something important that she hadn't mentioned before. Jennifer told detectives about an unknown man at the bar who had made her extremely uncomfortable. She described him as pushy and creepy, particularly in the way he asked personal questions. Most disturbing of all, this man had actually taken her phone without permission and entered his name and number into her contact list, apparently hoping she would call him later. Computer crimes detectives examined Jennifer's phone and were able to extract the contact information. They discovered that someone calling himself Jay Brown had been added to her phone, along with a 617 number, the exact same number that had appeared on Rebecca's phone records from the morning she was killed. Finally, investigators had identified their prime suspect. The 617 number that had called Rebecca twice on the morning of her murder belonged to the same person who had introduced himself as Jay Brown and had approached both women at the bar that night. However, before investigators could track down Jay Brown, they received urgent news from the Connecticut Crime Laboratory. The forensic team had been processing the duct tape that had been wrapped around Rebecca's body, and they had made an extraordinary discovery. Despite the fire damage, the fingerprint examiner had successfully developed 2 clear thumbprints, one from the left thumb and one from the right thumb, on the sticky side of the duct tape. As one expert noted, finding fingerprints on the adhesive side of tape was extremely rare under normal circumstances, and almost unheard of when the evidence had been through a fire. The fingerprints were immediately sent to the state database for comparison. After checking the prints against all the records on file, investigators got a positive identification. Both the left and right thumbprints matched a man named Evans Ganthier. Within a matter of hours, the investigation had uncovered 2 prime suspects for Rebecca's horrific murder. However, the question of who had actually killed her remained unanswered. The 2 suspects presented very different profiles. Jay Brown, the name used at the bar, had no criminal record that investigators could find. Evans Ganthier, on the other hand, had a documented criminal background that, while not particularly serious, contained several disturbing elements that caught investigators' attention. Ganthier's record included domestic violence incidents with his girlfriend, along with allegations that he had been involved in prostituting her. Even more concerning, there were reports that he enjoyed photographing women in his garage. These details created a troubling pattern that made investigators very interested in learning more about Evans Ganthier. To confirm the connection between their suspects, investigators asked Jennifer to return to the police station for a second interview. Since they now knew that Evans Ganthier's fingerprints were on the tape used to bind Rebecca's body, they wanted to see if Jennifer could identify him. Detectives created a photo lineup that included Evans Ganthier's picture among several other men. When they showed the array to Jennifer, she immediately and positively identified Ganthier as the man who had taken her phone at the bar, introduced himself as Jay, and entered his number into her contacts. With this confirmation, investigators focused all their resources on tracking down Ganthier. They knew he owned an SUV that he had received traffic tickets in and had been arrested while driving. They also learned that his girlfriend lived in the Bronx, so they began surveillance of her residence. After watching the location for some time, a surveillance team spotted Ganthier's SUV parked near his girlfriend's residence. The following day, they observed him walking to his vehicle. The moment he got into the car, police moved in and arrested him without incident. Ganthier was brought to police headquarters, where detectives prepared to interview him. Surprisingly, he was cooperative and gave consent for police to search both his vehicle and his residence. Ganthier claimed he had nothing to hide because he had played no role in Rebecca's death. When investigators searched his residence, they found his garage contained several items that raised suspicions. There was a paint roller, scrub brush, broom, cement cleaner, paint, and a paint tray. Most tellingly, there was a clear area on the garage floor that had obviously been scrubbed clean and painted over recently. While this looked highly suspicious, there was no direct evidence linking Rebecca to that location. However, when Ganthier's vehicle was processed at the crime laboratory, investigators made a shocking discovery. Throughout the car, they found questionable red stains that appeared to be blood. The stains were located on the center console between the driver's and passenger's seats, with blood that had dripped downward into the small space between the seat and console. Additional blood had pooled on the floor beneath the driver's seat. Investigators collected samples of all the blood found in the vehicle and sent them for DNA testing. The results were definitive. The blood belonged to Rebecca Coster. This proved that Rebecca had been inside Ganthier's vehicle and that something violent had happened to her while she was there. When confronted with this damning evidence, Ganthier didn't confess. Instead, he launched into an elaborate story attempting to explain away the evidence. He began by saying investigators wouldn't believe what had really happened that night. According to Ganthier's account, he had met Rebecca at the bar where they simply talked. He decided to call her later because he wanted to continue socializing after the bar closed. Rebecca had supposedly given him directions to her house, and when he arrived, she agreed to come with him to his place for a short time. She had explained that she couldn't stay long because she had to work in the morning. Ganthier claimed that while they were driving to his house, Rebecca suddenly started experiencing what appeared to be a medical emergency. She began foaming at the mouth and seemed to be having some kind of seizure or reaction. When they arrived at his garage, Rebecca was so unsteady on her feet that she needed his assistance just to walk. He had to put his arm around her to help her into the garage and keep her upright. He said he brought her into the house to get her a glass of water, thinking this might help with whatever medical issue she was experiencing. However, as they were walking through his garage, Rebecca supposedly tripped over a set of dumbbells that were on the floor. She hit her head on the concrete and immediately began bleeding heavily from the head injury. Ganthier continued his story by claiming he put Rebecca in the back of his SUV and began driving toward the local hospital. However, during the drive, he looked back and realized that Rebecca had stopped breathing. By the time he returned to his house, she was dead. According to Ganthier's account, his panic led him to make increasingly horrific decisions. He admitted to cutting off Rebecca's fingers and toes in an attempt to prevent identification through fingerprints. He also confessed to carefully carving the distinctive tattoo from her lower back, knowing it could be used to identify her. Ganthier told police that after mutilating Rebecca's body, he wrapped her remains and placed them in the back of his SUV. He then drove to the Port Jefferson ferry, which would take him across the water to Connecticut. Once he arrived in Connecticut, he claimed he simply drove around aimlessly, eventually ending up near Stonington. He insisted that he hadn't planned any of this and didn't know what to do with Rebecca's body. According to his story, he never intended to hurt or kill her, but now he was trapped in a situation where people might not believe his version of events. Ganthier admitted that he purchased gasoline and continued driving around Connecticut while trying to decide what to do. Eventually, he said, panic overwhelmed him completely. He had been driving around with Rebecca's body for hours and desperately wanted to get her out of his vehicle. He pulled over in the remote area where her body would later be discovered, threw her remains onto the side of the road, poured gasoline over them, and set them on fire. However, investigators saw through this elaborate story immediately. The sheer brutality and systematic nature of what had been done to Rebecca went far beyond what someone would do to cover up an accident. When a person goes to such extreme lengths, systematically removing identifying features, mutilating the body, transporting it across state lines, and burning it, they're not trying to hide an accidental death. They're trying to conceal murder. Evans Ganthier freely admitted to the horrific mutilation and burning of Rebecca's body, but he absolutely refused to admit that he had killed her. He maintained that her death was entirely accidental, the result of an unfortunate fall in his garage. Experienced detectives recognize this as a common pattern among killers who realize they've been caught. When someone commits brutal murder and knows their situation is hopeless, they often try to save face by minimizing their involvement. They'll admit to the parts of the crime that can be proven, but deny the actual killing, hoping to avoid the most serious charges. Ganthier was particularly convincing in his lies, displaying the characteristics commonly seen in sociopaths. He appeared to have no genuine remorse or conscience, and his primary concern was protecting himself from consequences. While he claimed he only wanted to remove Rebecca's identity after her accidental death, it was clear he was actually trying to eliminate any evidence that would show she had been violently murdered. The trial lasted an agonizing 4 weeks. After deliberating for just 5.5 hours, the jury reached their verdict. They found Evans Ganthier guilty of murder, concluding beyond a reasonable doubt that Rebecca's death was a homicide caused by stab wounds, not any kind of accident. The judge sentenced Ganthier to the maximum penalty allowed, 25 years to life in prison. During sentencing, the judge condemned Ganthier's unthinkably cruel behavior, not just in killing Rebecca, but in the horrific things he had done to her body afterward. For Rebecca's mother, the guilty verdict brought relief rather than happiness. While she was glad that Ganthier wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else, nothing could bring her daughter back. She admitted that she wished she could be the type of person who could forgive, but in this case, forgiveness was impossible. The loss of her daughter and the brutal nature of her death had left wounds that would never fully heal. September 30th, 2025. Vallejo, California. A detached unit behind a dilapidated house on 14th Street near Star Avenue. This is where detectives made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. The smell hit them first, thick, suffocating, unmistakable. Death has an odor you can never forget, and it was seeping through the cracks of a wall that shouldn't have been there. Inside that cramped, filthy attic space, behind boards that had been hastily nailed together and painted over to blend in with the rest of the structure, they found her. Renia Lewis, 28 years old, dismembered, stuffed into a hidden compartment like she was nothing more than garbage to be disposed of. But here's what makes this discovery absolutely chilling. The police had already been here. For days earlier, they'd walked through this exact house, searching for this exact woman. They'd checked rooms, opened closets, looked in every visible space where a person could hide. And they'd found nothing, because she was sealed behind a wall they didn't know existed, hidden so carefully that even trained investigators missed her completely. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a sudden act of rage. This was calculated, methodical, the work of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Someone who built a tomb inside a house of horrors and hoped no one would ever find it. The house itself was a nightmare. Mountains of trash reaching the ceiling. Rotting garbage creating narrow pathways you had to turn sideways to squeeze through. The stench of decay mixed with years of accumulated filth. Neighbors called it a hoarder house, a junkyard, a place that looked abandoned even when people were living there. It was the perfect place to hide something or someone you never wanted found. When detectives returned on that Tuesday with a search warrant and a gut feeling they'd missed something critical, they tore through that attic with renewed determination. And that's when they noticed it. A section of wall that didn't quite match. Boards that looked newer than the rest. Paint that hadn't quite blended in. Something that screamed deliberate concealment. One detective grabbed a crowbar and started prying. The wood splintered and cracked. And when that false wall came down, revealing the cramped space behind it, several officers turned away and wept. Because what they saw wasn't just a body. It was evidence of pure, calculated evil. Renia had been cut into pieces, hidden away like a dark secret, sealed behind that wall by someone who thought he could make her disappear forever. Someone who almost succeeded. But why was she here? How did a vibrant young woman with dreams of becoming a social worker end up dismembered and stuffed behind a wall in a stranger's attic? How did she go from laughing with friends on a Friday night to becoming a victim of one of Vallejo's most horrifying murders? That's the question that tormented everyone. Her family, the investigators, the community that rallied to find her. Because just 4 days earlier, on September 26th, Renia Lewis had been alive. Happy. Full of life. Making plans for a future she'd never see. And somewhere between that Friday night and the moment her mother reported her missing on Sunday, someone lured her to this house of nightmares. Someone convinced her to walk through that door. Someone destroyed her, dismembered her, and tried to erase her from existence. This is the story of how that monster almost got away with it. This is the story of Renia Lewis and the hidden wall that became her grave. Renia Lewis was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. Vibrant, kind, the type who checked in on her mom every single day, who never missed a shift at the youth center, who made everyone around her feel seen and loved. She had dreams, big ones. She wanted to be a social worker, to help kids and families who had nobody else. She was full of life, full of hope, full of plans for a future that would never come. That Friday night, September 26th, she was out with friends in Vallejo, laughing, enjoying herself, living her life the way any 28-year-old should. Around 10 o'clock, she told her friends she was heading out, said she had to stop by someone's place real quick before going home. No big deal, right? Just a quick errand. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. By Saturday morning, her phone went silent. No texts, no calls, nothing. Her mother, Terry, tried reaching out, but the messages sat unread, unanswered. At first, Terry thought maybe her daughter had put her phone on Do Not Disturb, something she did sometimes when she wanted to sleep in. But Saturday turned into Sunday, and still nothing. That's when the panic set in. By Sunday afternoon, Terry was frantic. She opened the Life 360 app on her phone, the one that tracks family members' locations, and saw something that made her blood run cold. Renia's last known location wasn't at a friend's house. It wasn't at a restaurant or a store. It was near a property on 14th Street in Vallejo, a place Terry had never heard of, a place Renia had no reason to be. Something was very, very wrong. The family didn't waste time. They called the police immediately, filed a missing persons report, and begged for help. Officers responded quickly, entering Renia into the missing persons database and heading straight to that 14th Street address. What they found was a disaster zone. The house looked abandoned, half falling apart, surrounded by junk and debris like some kind of urban wasteland. Inside the detached unit out back, the conditions were even worse. Trash everywhere. Boxes stacked to the ceiling. Narrow walkways barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through. The officers searched as best they could. Checked the rooms, looked in closets, scanned every visible space where a person could hide. They found nothing. No sign of Renia. No sign of anything suspicious. So they left. But here's the thing, she was there. The whole time. just a few feet away from where those officers stood, hidden behind a wall they didn't even know existed. The family refused to give up. They hit the streets, retracing Renia's steps, searching everywhere they could think of. And that's when they found something that turned this case from worrying to terrifying. Renia's phone, on a rooftop, not dropped on the ground, not left in a car, on a rooftop, like someone had thrown it there, trying to get rid of it, trying to make sure no one could track where she'd been. That discovery sent shockwaves through the investigation. This wasn't just a missing person anymore. This was something far darker. By Monday, law enforcement kicked into high gear. They activated an Ebony Alert, a California system designed to help locate missing Black women and girls. The FBI joined the case, bringing in resources and expertise. The community rallied, spreading Renia's picture across social media, organizing search parties, doing everything they could to bring her home. But Tuesday, October 1st, was when everything changed. Detectives returned to that same house on 14th Street, this time armed with a search warrant and new information that suggested they'd missed something critical during their first sweep. They knew the conditions inside were brutal. Trash piled high, narrow pathways, darkness swallowing every corner. But this time, they weren't leaving until they'd torn the place apart. And that's when they saw it. A section of the attic wall that didn't match the rest. Boards nailed up hastily, paint that didn't quite blend in. Something that looked deliberately constructed to hide what was behind it. One of the detectives pulled at the boards. The wood cracked and splintered, and when the wall came down, the smell hit them first, thick, unmistakable, the stench of death. Behind that secret wall, stuffed into a space barely big enough to hold a human body, was Renia. She'd been dismembered, cut into pieces, hidden like she was nothing more than garbage. The officers who found her wept. Seasoned investigators who'd seen the worst of humanity broke down at the sight of what had been done to this young woman. This wasn't just murder. This was something monstrous. The family's worst nightmare had come true. Terry Lewis, Renia's mother, collapsed when detectives told her the news. She later said she'd prayed the entire drive over, begging God to let it be someone else, anyone else. But God didn't answer that prayer. Renia's cousin, LaToya, told reporters through tears that you would never have found her if you didn't know that wall was there. She was hidden so carefully, so deliberately, that even trained officers missed her the first time. The killer had planned this. He'd constructed that wall, stuffed her body inside, and sealed it up like he was burying a secret forever. But who would do this? And why? Enter Douglas Irwin Shaw, 41 years old, a mechanic at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom. A man with a history of violence, a man who'd had a restraining order filed against him just 2 years earlier by a terrified ex-girlfriend who said he was controlling, unstable, and dangerous. Police arrested Shaw at his workplace the same day they found Renia's body. He didn't resist, didn't run, just went quietly, like he'd been expecting this moment all along. And then he confessed, told investigators he'd killed her, admitted to stabbing her with a knife, dismembering her body, and hiding her remains behind that wall. But here's the thing that makes this case even more chilling. He never explained why. No motive, no reason, no justification for the absolute horror he'd inflicted on this innocent woman. So what was the connection between Renia and Shaw? That's the question that haunted everyone. Because as far as anyone could tell, there wasn't one. They weren't dating, weren't friends, didn't work together. Family members said Renia had never mentioned his name, never talked about knowing anyone who lived on 14th Street. So how did she end up there? How did she end up in his hands? Investigators believe she may have been lured there under false pretenses, told she was meeting someone else, maybe, or convinced there was something she needed to pick up. Whatever the reason, she walked into that house willingly, with no idea what was waiting for her. And that's what makes this story so terrifying. Because Renia wasn't doing anything wrong. She wasn't in a dangerous situation. She was just living her life, trusting the wrong person at the wrong time. And it cost her everything. Shaw's background painted a disturbing picture. Coworkers said he was quiet, kept to himself, seemed normal enough on the surface. But that ex-girlfriend's restraining order told a different story. She described him as volatile, controlling, someone who made her fear for her safety. She'd gotten out just in time. Renia wasn't so lucky. Shaw didn't live at the 14th Street property full-time, but he had access to it, used it as a hideout of sorts. Neighbors said they'd seen him coming and going, always alone, always skulking around like he had something to hide. They described the place as creepy, unsettling, the kind of house you cross the street to avoid. And inside that house of horrors, Shaw committed an act so brutal, so senseless, that even hardened detectives struggled to comprehend it. The forensic evidence told the rest of the story. DNA found at the scene matched both Renia and Shaw, tying him definitively to the crime. Security cameras from nearby homes captured footage of a man matching Shaw's description moving items into the detached unit around midnight that Friday, right around the time Renia disappeared. And then there was the phone. That phone found on the rooftop wasn't just discarded. It was thrown there deliberately, an attempt to destroy the digital trail that led straight to Shaw's door. But he wasn't smart enough to cover all his tracks. The GPS data, the surveillance footage, the DNA, it all pointed to him. When Shaw was arraigned a few days later, he stood in court and did something that enraged everyone who loved Renia. Despite his confession to police, despite admitting to investigators that he'd killed her, he pleaded not guilty. Not guilty, like he hadn't just torn a family apart. Like he hadn't butchered a woman for no reason and hidden her body behind a wall like she was nothing. Renia's friends stood outside the courthouse, furious and heartbroken. One of them said, "If you admitted what you did, why are you changing your story now? Just own it. Just admit you're a monster." But Shaw stayed silent, staring straight ahead with that same blank expression witnesses had described during his interrogation. Cold, emotionless, detached from the horror he'd caused. The impact of this case rippled through Vallejo like an earthquake. This was the 14th homicide in the city in 2025 alone. A staggering number for a community already struggling with violence and crime. People were scared, angry, demanding answers. How does a woman go missing and end up dead in a house police had already searched? How does a killer hide a body so well that trained officers walk right past it? What does that say about safety, about protection, about the systems meant to keep people like Renia alive? Community members held vigils in her honor, lighting candles and leaving flowers outside the 14th Street property. They shared memories of her kindness, her ambition, the way she made everyone feel loved. They cried together, grieved together, and demanded justice together. But for Terry Lewis, Renia's mother, no amount of justice would ever be enough. She told reporters that her daughter fought. She knew Renia didn't go down without a fight. And the thought of her baby girl's final moments, terrified, alone, fighting for her life, was something no mother should ever have to imagine. Terry said she'd prayed for a miracle, prayed that when they found Renia, she'd still be alive. But when detectives came to her door with that look on their faces, she already knew. The prayer hadn't been answered. Her daughter was gone. And the monster who took her? He'd hidden her so carefully, so callously, that she'd been there all along, just waiting to be found. This case exposed the brutal reality of how easily someone can vanish, how quickly life can be stolen, how thoroughly evil can hide in plain sight. That house on 14th Street, with its mountains of trash and secret walls, became a symbol of everything terrifying about human darkness. The police chief called it a senseless act of violence. But those words feel hollow when you think about what Renia endured. Senseless doesn't begin to cover it. This was calculated, cruel, a deliberate erasure of a human being. And Shaw? He's sitting in jail right now, awaiting trial, refusing to explain why he did it. Maybe there is no explanation. Maybe some people are just evil, plain and simple. Maybe some monsters don't need a reason. But Renia Lewis deserved better. She deserved to grow old, to help the families she dreamed of saving, to laugh with her friends and hug her mother and live the beautiful life she was building. Instead, she's a name on a list, a story told to warn others, a reminder that danger can lurk anywhere, even behind walls you'd never think to check. So here's what we're left with: a family shattered by grief, community demanding change, A killer who confessed but refuses to accept responsibility. And a woman who should still be here, whose light was snuffed out by someone who had no right to take it. This is the story of Renia Lewis, and it's a story that should never have had to be told.
Please, can you just convince him to let me go? She said, I'll do anything, just let me go. And she even offered oral sex. I had her give me oral sex. She gave me oral sex. I fixed myself, I fixed my clothes. I put her back like I found her and went back into the living room and sat down.
Imagine walking to your car and suddenly being pulled into a nightmare that you can't escape. On a cold January night in Knoxville, Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom were abducted at gunpoint, then subjected to horror beyond imagination, tortured, raped, and left to die in the most brutal ways possible. One beaten until she suffocated in a trash can, the other dragged to railroad tracks and shot. His body set ablaze in a horrifying attempt to erase the crime. This is the darkest crime scene you've never heard, a story of unimaginable cruelty and despair. Brace yourself as we unravel the chilling details behind the murders that shook a city to its core. On a freezing Sunday morning in early January 2007, a man working for the railroad company walked along the train tracks that ran behind Chipman Street in Knoxville, Tennessee. The air was bitter cold, and the city was just beginning to stir awake. Everything seemed ordinary until he noticed something that would haunt him forever. There, beside the tracks, lay what appeared to be a bundle wrapped in bedding. As he moved closer, the horrible truth became clear. It was a human body, burned so badly that recognizing any features was impossible. The victim's hands had been tied behind their back using shoelaces. This was a young man named Christopher Newsom, only 23 years old. He had been shot 3 times, sexually violated, and set ablaze while he was still breathing. But the nightmare didn't end there. Just a short distance away, inside a small rental property on Chipman Street, another victim was taking her final breaths in the most horrific way imaginable. A young woman lay dying in complete darkness, her body broken from hours of brutal torture. Someone had forced bleach down her throat, and now she was crammed inside a kitchen trash bin, wrapped in garbage bags, slowly running out of air. Her name was Shannon Christian, a 21-year-old college student who had her entire future ahead of her. Less than half a day earlier, she and Christopher had been just another happy young couple making simple weekend plans. They were supposed to grab dinner, maybe see a movie, and then meet friends at a party. Normal things that normal couples do on Saturday nights. Instead, 5 dangerous people spotted them and decided to make them victims. What happened over the next 2 days involved such savage torture and cruelty that it would eventually require 12 years and 8 separate court trials before everyone responsible faced proper punishment. Before understanding what happened to them, you need to know who Shannon and Christopher really were as people. They weren't just names in a news story. They were real human beings with hopes, dreams, and plans for their futures that were violently stolen away from them. Shannon Gail Christian came into this world on April 29, 1985, in a small Texas town. When she turned 12, her family decided to relocate to Tennessee, settling into a peaceful suburban area of Knoxville. This is where Shannon truly came into her own as a person. During her time at the local high school, she became known as someone special. Her teachers would later remember how her genuine smile could light up an entire classroom. Friends described her as someone who had a gift for making others feel important and valued. She possessed that rare ability to walk into any space and immediately lift the spirits of everyone around her. But Shannon was much more than just a friendly face with a warm personality. She had real intelligence and serious ambition. She knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. By the beginning of 2007, she was mere weeks away from earning her degree in sociology from the University of Tennessee. She hadn't chosen this field because it was easy or convenient. She picked it because she genuinely wanted to make the world a better place. Shannon had specific plans to work with disadvantaged communities and help people who needed support the most. When she looked at the world's problems, she didn't just feel sad about them. She wanted to actually do something to fix them. Her parents had watched their daughter grow with enormous pride. Here was this remarkable young woman who enjoyed playing golf, consistently excelled in her academic work, and still managed to find time to care deeply about the people in her life. To her mother and father, she was nothing short of miraculous. On that particular Saturday in early January 2007, her parents fully expected to see their daughter walk through the door by Sunday morning. They had absolutely no reason to feel concerned about anything. Shannon was known for always keeping her promises and checking in when she said she would. Christopher Newsom was born and raised in Knoxville. He arrived in this world on September 21, 1983, and grew up to be exactly the kind of young man that small-town communities point to with pride. During his years at the local high school, Christopher became well known as a talented baseball player. But his success on the field didn't come from being the biggest or strongest athlete. It came from the incredible heart and determination he brought to every single game. His teammates would remember him as someone who played with complete passion, who encouraged and supported other players, and who never let personal ego interfere with being a good teammate. When high school ended and many of his classmates left town chasing bigger opportunities in distant cities, Christopher made a different choice. He decided to stay home. He enrolled at the nearby community college where he learned carpentry skills and discovered his true calling. He became exceptionally skilled at his craft. Even today, if you drive through the county, you can still see the beautiful crown molding and woodwork that Christopher created with his own hands. Each piece serves as a lasting reminder of a young man who took genuine pride in building things that would endure. At 23 years old, Christopher wasn't just building houses and furniture. He was actively building a future with Shannon Christian. Everyone who knew them agreed they made a perfect match. She brought the fire and big dreams, while he provided stability and made those dreams feel achievable. Christopher was the kind of person who responded to messages immediately. He showed up exactly when he said he would. He never left people guessing about where he was or whether he was all right. That particular Saturday began like any other typical weekend for this young couple. They had made simple, unremarkable plans. The exact same kind of plans that millions of young couples across the entire country make every single Saturday night. Get some dinner, possibly catch a movie at the theater, then head over to a friend's gathering to socialize, laugh, and enjoy being young and in love together. Nothing fancy or extraordinary, just another regular evening in the lives of two people who had absolutely no idea they were living through their final hours on Earth. Shannon spent her afternoon at her close friend's apartment getting ready for the evening. She took her time preparing, making sure every detail was just right, the way she always did. Her friends would later recall that she seemed to be in an especially great mood that day, genuinely excited about the fun night that lay ahead. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, Christopher drove up in his truck to collect her. Security footage from the apartment complex would eventually capture what happened next, though at that particular moment, nobody was paying any special attention to the completely ordinary scene unfolding in a completely ordinary parking lot. Shannon walked out to meet Christopher by his vehicle. They shared a warm embrace, a simple and sweet moment between two people who deeply cared for each other. The kind of tender moment that probably happens thousands of times every single day in parking lots all across the world. But on this night, that moment was different. Hidden somewhere in the shadows of that same parking lot, dangerous people were carefully watching them. 5 individuals who had spent their entire Saturday night driving around the area actively searching for potential victims. They were looking for someone to harm, someone to hurt, someone to completely destroy. And in that moment, Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom became their chosen targets. What unfolded in the next few minutes happened with terrifying speed. In less than 5 minutes, everything changed completely. Armed men suddenly surrounded the young couple, pointing loaded firearms directly at them. Both Shannon and Christopher found themselves staring at gun barrels, unable to process what was happening. They were immediately forced into the back of Shannon's own Toyota SUV against their will. Someone quickly tied their hands behind their backs using shoelaces. Their ordinary Saturday evening had just transformed into a living nightmare beyond imagination. The vehicle pulled away from the apartment parking lot around 9 o'clock that night. Inside the SUV, there were now 7 people total. Shannon and Christopher sat as terrified prisoners, while 5 attackers surrounded them, already forming plans for unspeakable acts of violence. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, their group of friends had begun gathering for the birthday celebration. People started checking their phones repeatedly. Everyone was wondering the same thing. Where were Shannon and Christopher? It was completely unlike either of them to run late without at least calling or sending a message to explain. Friends tried sending text messages. Nothing came back. They tried calling both phones. Every call went straight to voicemail without ringing. By 10 o'clock that night, genuine worry had begun spreading through the group. By 11 o'clock, several concerned friends decided to drive back to the apartment complex where the couple had last been seen. When they arrived, they found Christopher's truck still sitting exactly where he had parked it earlier. But Shannon's SUV had vanished completely, and so had both Shannon and Christopher themselves. Just 3 miles away, inside a rental property on Chipman Street, the real horror was only beginning to unfold. The address was 2316 Chipman Street, located in the northern part of Knoxville. From the outside, the house appeared completely ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of place you would drive right past without giving it a second glance. But inside those walls, it had become a breeding ground for terrible violence. The house was being rented by a 25-year-old man named LaMarcus Davidson. Davidson wasn't just someone who occasionally broke the law. He was what you would call a career predator, someone who had spent most of his adult life hurting other people. Just 5 months before this night, he had been released from prison after serving a full 5-year sentence for carjacking and aggravated robbery. Within just a few months of getting out, he had already returned to his old patterns. He was dealing illegal drugs and planning violent crimes from his base of operations at the Chipman Street house. Davidson didn't operate alone, though. His half-brother, a 24-year-old man named Latalvis Cobbins, had his own criminal history that included multiple robbery convictions. The two brothers had a toxic relationship where they seemed to feed off each other's violent tendencies. Each one pushed the other toward increasingly terrible acts of cruelty. Then there was a man named George Thomas, also 24 years old. People on the streets knew him by the nickname Detroit. Thomas had been convicted of multiple serious crimes and had earned a reputation for extreme brutality that made even other hardened criminals feel nervous around him. The oldest member of the group was a 34-year-old man named Eric Boyd. He was yet another career criminal who had accumulated a long list of violent offenses over the years. For men who had dedicated their entire lives to hurting innocent people had now gathered together in one location, like a pack of rabid animals. But this group had a fifth member, someone who would prove that evil behavior isn't limited to just one gender. Her name was Vanessa Coleman, and she was only 18 years old. She was Cobbins' girlfriend. On that Saturday evening in early January, these 5 dangerous individuals made a decision that would seal the fate of 2 completely innocent people. They were going out hunting. They were actively looking for victims they could rob, sexually assault, and terrorize. They didn't have any specific plan or particular target already chosen. They were simply driving around the streets of Knoxville, cruising through different neighborhoods, patiently waiting for the right opportunity to present itself. That opportunity appeared at the apartment complex where Shannon and Christopher had met up. Davidson, Cobbins, and Boyd were all sitting in one car, slowly cruising through the parking complex. They spotted Shannon's Toyota SUV and immediately recognized it as a nice vehicle worth stealing. Then they saw Shannon and Christopher together. The decision was made in mere seconds. Weapons were drawn from hiding. Within moments, both Shannon and Christopher found themselves looking directly down the barrels of loaded guns. Their normal Saturday night was transforming into absolute terror. Simple words were spoken that changed everything. "Get in the car." The SUV pulled away from the apartment complex around 9 o'clock. The 3-mile drive to Chipman Street would become the longest and most terrifying journey of Shannon and Christopher's entire lives. Inside the vehicle, Davidson had taken control of the steering wheel. Cobbins sat in the passenger seat beside him. Boyd remained in the back seat, controlling both victims, making absolutely certain they understood that any attempt to escape or resist would result in their immediate deaths. For Shannon and Christopher, those 3 miles must have felt like they lasted an eternity. At the house on Chipman Street, Thomas and Coleman were waiting for the others to arrive. Everything was ready. But before all that horror began, one particularly chilling moment occurred at 12:33 in the morning on January 7th. Shannon's phone suddenly rang. Somehow, impossibly, she managed to call her parents. When they answered, she told them in a steady voice that gave no hint whatsoever of the terror surrounding her that she would be back between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. It was a complete lie that had been forced upon her by her captors. A cruel deception carefully designed to buy them time before anyone would realize she and Christopher were actually missing. It would be the last time her parents would ever hear their daughter's voice speaking to them. What happened inside that house on Chipman Street over the next several hours would eventually become evidence presented in one of Tennessee's most horrific murder trials. Christopher was immediately separated from Shannon the moment they arrived at the house. His hands were bound behind his back using shoelaces. Someone forced a sock into his mouth to muffle any screams he might make. His head was covered with a sweatshirt that was tied around his neck with more shoelaces, leaving him completely blind and struggling to breathe properly. Christopher was sexually assaulted inside Davidson's house. The forensic evidence showed injuries consistent with being violated using some kind of object. This wasn't just murder. This was deliberate torture specifically designed to inflict the maximum amount of suffering possible. Sometime in the early morning hours of January 7th, Eric Boyd forced Christopher to march barefoot from the house. Outside, the Tennessee winter had turned brutally cold. Temperatures had dropped well below freezing. Christopher, wearing only a shirt and underwear, was forced to walk nearly half a mile through the bitter cold to reach a set of railroad tracks that ran behind the house. His bare feet left bloody prints in the frozen ground. A damaged dog leash found along the route would later strongly suggest it had been used to control him during this final torturous walk to the place of his execution. At the railroad tracks, Christopher was shot 3 times. The first bullet struck him in the neck. He survived that shot. The second bullet struck him in the back. He was still alive. The third and final shot was fired with the gun's muzzle pressed directly against his head just above his right ear. The bullet severed his brainstem instantly. Christopher Newsom died right there at 23 years old. But even death itself wasn't enough for these monsters who had taken his life. They wrapped Christopher's body in a comforter, poured gasoline all over it, and set him on fire. When a railroad worker discovered the charred remains the following afternoon on January 7th, the body had been burned so severely that dental records had to be used to confirm the victim's identity. Any DNA evidence that might have connected specific attackers to Christopher's sexual assault had been completely destroyed by the flames. This wasn't some accident or oversight. It was part of their deliberate plan to cover their tracks. While Christopher was being murdered at the railroad tracks, Shannon was beginning a nightmare that would continue for 2 more days. She was held prisoner primarily in the north bedroom of Davidson's house. Vanessa Coleman was assigned to watch over her while the men went out to carry out their killing. Coleman, who was barely 18 years old, would eventually claim that she was just as much a victim as Shannon. But the evidence would tell a completely different story. Forensic testimony would reveal that Shannon was repeatedly sexually assaulted by multiple attackers over the entire course of her captivity. DNA evidence would later confirm with certainty that both Davidson and Cobbins had sexually violated her. Medical examination described her injuries as extreme and far beyond what could be considered a simple sexual assault. But the sexual violence represented only part of her suffering during those terrible hours. Shannon was beaten over and over again. She was kicked in the groin area. Her head sustained severe trauma from blunt force injuries. Carpet burns covered much of her body, strongly suggesting she had been dragged across floors during the assaults. According to Davidson's own confession that he would later make, at some point during her captivity, Shannon looked directly at her attackers and spoke words that would haunt everyone who would eventually hear them. She said simply, "I don't want to die." Her plea for mercy fell on completely deaf ears. In the final hours of her life, Shannon's attackers made a calculated decision to destroy DNA evidence that could link them to their crimes. They poured bleach down her throat. They scrubbed her battered body with cleaning chemicals, paying particular attention to areas where they knew they had left biological evidence behind. The bleach burned her mouth and throat badly. The chemical burns would be clearly visible later during her autopsy examination. Then came the final horror of all. Still alive, still breathing, Shannon was bound in what would be described as a hogtied position using curtains and strips of bedding material. Her face was covered with a small plastic bag. Her body was stuffed into multiple large trash bags. She was then placed inside a residential garbage can in Davidson's kitchen and covered with sheets. Medical testimony was absolutely clear on this point. Shannon Christian slowly suffocated to death inside that garbage can. She was conscious throughout the ordeal. She knew exactly what was happening to her. According to the timeline that would be established at trial, Shannon died sometime between the afternoon of January 7th and the afternoon of January 8th, which meant at least 12 hours passed after Christopher had already been murdered. While Shannon was dying her slow, agonizing death, Davidson was seen wearing Christopher's shoes and using his cell phone as if they were his own possessions. Sunday morning, January 7th, 2007. Shannon's parents were staring at their phones, waiting for a call that would never come. Their daughter had promised to be home between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. It was now past 10 o'clock in the morning, and there had been no word from their daughter at all. This wasn't like Shannon at all. She always kept her promises. She always called when she said she would. Meanwhile, across town, Christopher's parents were experiencing the same terrifying realization. Their son hadn't come home. His bed hadn't been slept in. By Sunday afternoon, genuine panic had set in among everyone who knew them. The families contacted the local police department, desperate for help and guidance. Officers suggested that maybe the young couple had just decided to spend the weekend together somewhere. The families were told to wait 24 hours before filing an official missing persons report. 24 hours of waiting, while Shannon was dying in a garbage can just 3 miles away from where her parents stood. Frustrated and terrified beyond words, the families decided to take matters into their own hands. They organized their own search parties with volunteers. They contacted Shannon's cell phone provider themselves, demanding to know the last location where her phone had pinged a cell tower. The answer led them to a tower on Cherry Street in North Knoxville. Late Sunday night stretching into early Monday morning on January 8th, family members and friends combed through the Cherry Street area systematically. At approximately 1:30 in the morning on January 8th, they found it. The SUV was parked at the intersection of Chipman Street and Glider Avenue. The vehicle immediately told a story of violence to those who examined it carefully. The front seats had been pushed all the way back as far as they would go. The floorboards were covered in mud and dirt. Personal items she always kept in the car were missing, but authorities found something in the car that didn't belong there at all. A pack of cigarettes sat on the dashboard. Neither Shannon nor Christopher smoked cigarettes. An envelope was found inside the SUV. Authorities processed the envelope carefully for fingerprints and got a hit in their system almost immediately. The print belonged to a man named LaMarcus Davidson, with an address at 2316 Chipman Street. On January 9, 2007, police obtained a search warrant for Davidson's house and prepared to execute it. When officers arrived, they found the house completely empty. Davidson and his associates had fled the scene, but the evidence they left behind would tell a horrifying story. In the kitchen area, authorities made the discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their entire careers. Shannon Christian's body was stuffed inside a residential garbage can, wrapped in multiple trash bags like discarded garbage. The DNA evidence collected from the scene proved to be overwhelming. Davidson's biological material was found inside Shannon's body. His fingerprints were found on the garbage bags that contained her remains. Cobbin's DNA was also recovered from the victim's body. Items belonging to both Shannon and Christopher were scattered throughout the house. Shannon's purse was there. Her camera was found with photographs that had been ripped apart and burned. Christopher's baseball caps were scattered around. The killers had kept trophies from their crimes. Shell casings found inside Davidson's house matched perfectly with the bullets that had killed Christopher at the railroad tracks. But Davidson and his accomplices had already vanished. A massive manhunt was launched immediately. The breakthrough came on January 11th when authorities traced phone calls that had been made between Davidson and Eric Boyd. Boyd, feeling the pressure of the investigation closing in, agreed to lead authorities to Davidson's hiding place. When officers stormed the location, they found Davidson there. He was still wearing Christopher's shoes. They also recovered a .22 caliber revolver, the murder weapon. Over the next several days, the remaining suspects fell one by one. Thomas, Cobbins, and Coleman were all arrested in Lebanon, Kentucky. Authorities seized a computer that showed the suspects had been actively monitoring news coverage of the murders. 5 arrests. 5 killers who apparently thought they had committed the perfect crime and would get away with everything. But they had badly underestimated the determination of 2 families who absolutely refused to let their children be forgotten. The trials began in 2008. For both families, this meant reliving their absolute worst nightmare in excruciating detail as prosecutors systematically laid out all the evidence against each killer. Eric Boyd was the first to face trial, but only in federal court for being an accessory after the fact to the crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. The families knew immediately that this wasn't nearly enough punishment. During the subsequent trials, DNA evidence was presented in painstaking detail. Forensic experts testified about biological material found in various locations on Shannon's body and clothing. The photographs from the autopsy examination were displayed on a large screen, shown almost frame by frame. The images were extremely graphic in nature. They were so disturbing that one of the prosecutors actually grew faint early on into the autopsy presentation. Court had to take a break. She did not return to the courtroom for the rest of that day. In August 2009, Latalvis Cobbins faced a jury. After hearing all of the horrific evidence presented against him, they sentenced him to life in prison without any possibility of parole. 2 months later, it was Lamarcus Davidson's turn to face justice. He was the ringleader who had orchestrated this entire nightmare. The jury didn't hesitate in their decision. Davidson was sentenced to death. George Thomas received life in prison without parole. Vanessa Coleman was sentenced to 53 years in prison. By 2010, it seemed like everything was finally over. Then everything suddenly collapsed in the most unexpected way. The judge who had presided over all 4 state trials, it turned out, had been living a shocking double life the entire time. In March 2011, he was forced to resign from his position after admitting to years of serious drug addiction. He had been buying prescription pills illegally from convicted felons. He had been impaired by drugs while overseeing the most important murder trials in the county's entire history. In September 2011, he was officially disbarred. On December 1, 2011, all 4 defendants were granted new trials. The families who had already endured years of painful testimony would have to go through the entire ordeal all over again from the beginning. The retrials began in 2012. Coleman was convicted again, but this time with a reduced sentence of 35 years. Thomas was found guilty once again. The state's highest court ultimately upheld Davidson and Cobbins' original convictions. But Eric Boyd still hadn't faced state murder charges for his role in actually killing Christopher and assaulting Shannon. Christopher's parents refused to give up their fight for full justice. His mother later said she had a gut feeling deep down that Eric Boyd was the one who killed him, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. They attended every single hearing and every appeal. The breakthrough in Boyd's case finally came in 2018. 11 years after the murders had taken place, a grand jury finally indicted Eric Boyd on 36 separate counts, including first-degree murder charges. Boyd's trial began in August 2019. George Thomas agreed to testify against him in exchange for having his own sentence reduced. On August 13, 2019, exactly 12 years, 7 months, and 7 days after the murders occurred, Eric Boyd was found guilty on nearly all of the charges brought against him. He was sentenced to life in prison without any possibility of parole, plus an additional 90 years. Finally, after more than a decade of legal proceedings, all 5 killers were behind bars for the rest of their lives. Justice had been served in the end, but it had come at an enormous cost to everyone involved. 12 years of brutal legal battles, millions of dollars in public funds spent, countless hours forcing the families to relive their absolute worst memories over and over again. And despite all of that, 2 young people remained dead, their futures stolen forever. From this unimaginable tragedy, However, came meaningful change to the legal system itself. In June 2014, the state's governor signed 2 landmark laws that were named after the victims to honor their memory. The first law, named after Christopher, eliminated an old requirement that meant someone in authority had to validate a jury's unanimous verdict before it could stand. This outdated rule had allowed the corrupt behavior of the original trial overseer to invalidate all the convictions. Under Christopher's law, once a jury delivers a unanimous verdict, that verdict stands firm. The second law, named after Shannon, protects victims from character assassination during court proceedings. Defense attorneys can no longer make irrelevant allegations against victims unless those allegations are directly related to the actual case being tried. The house located at 2316 Chipman Street was completely demolished in 2008. In its place now stands a memorial where Shannon and Christopher are remembered with proper dignity and respect. A foundation was established in Shannon's full name that provides scholarships for university students through an annual golf tournament. Another memorial foundation was established in Christopher's name that holds a yearly baseball tournament. Over the years since its creation, it has provided 42 scholarships to local high school students. 18 years after their deaths, 2 young people who had their entire futures violently stolen away have become guardians of justice for countless others. Their names now protect victims across the entire state. Their memories fund dreams and opportunities for students who might otherwise never get the chance to pursue higher education. Shannon had wanted to help underserved communities and make the world better. In death, her foundation continues that exact mission. Christopher took great pride in building things that would last and endure. His memorial foundation builds futures that endure for generations to come. Evil tried its absolute hardest to erase them from existence and memory. Instead, their legacy has grown stronger with each passing year. January 6, 2007 will forever mark one of the darkest chapters in the city's entire history. 18 years later, Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom's names are spoken not just as victims of terrible violence, but as forces for positive change in the world. Laws protect other victims because of what happened to them. Students receive scholarships and opportunities in their memory. Their killers will never walk free again. The families will never stop grieving for their lost children. The pain remains with them every single day, but they have managed to transform their unimaginable loss into something powerful and meaningful. A legacy that continues to grow stronger with every year that passes. In the end, that is what truly endures beyond everything else. Not the evil that tried to destroy them and erase their memory, but the light that continues to shine brightly in their memory. Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom, 2 names that deserve to be remembered forever. 17 years old, asleep in the back seat after a night at a concert, and moments later, her throat was slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. But the horror didn't end there. Her killer, someone she thought she could trust, sat beside her lifeless body, blasting music, building a bonfire, and snapping photos of her corpse to share online. This wasn't just a murder. It was a performance, staged for the world to witness, and it's one of the most disturbing true crime cases of the internet age. That Sunday morning in July felt like any other summer day for most people. The sun was shining, and many were enjoying their weekend routines. But for a group of young friends scattered across the country, this ordinary morning would become a nightmare they'd never forget. One friend picked up her phone to check her messages and immediately noticed something was wrong. Her group chat was flooded with frantic messages, more activity than she'd ever seen. As she scrolled through the conversations, her heart began to race. There was an image that made her stomach turn. It appeared to show someone she knew, someone she cared about, and something terrible had happened to them. The messages were filled with panic and confusion. Friends were typing rapidly, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. "Did you see what someone posted on Discord?" One message read. "Someone is saying something happened to Bianca," wrote another. The word "dead" kept appearing in the messages, but nobody wanted to believe it could be true. As the disturbing image continued to spread through their online communities, some members were so alarmed that they felt compelled to contact authorities. They weren't sure what else to do when faced with something so shocking and potentially real. The calls started coming into police stations, with people reporting that they'd seen what appeared to be evidence of a serious crime posted online. Meanwhile, across social media platforms, people were beginning to notice an unusual trend. A name was appearing more and more frequently, accompanied by disturbing images that seemed too graphic to be real. Many users assumed it was another internet hoax or perhaps scenes from a horror movie being shared for shock value. The authenticity of the image became a subject of heated debate online. Some communities had a history of sharing fake or disturbing content just to get reactions from people. So many hoped this was just another tasteless joke. People desperately wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it was just someone's idea of a cruel prank. But the more the image circulated, the more people became convinced that something genuinely terrible had occurred. The horror was that instead of the image being taken down or reported appropriately, some people began treating it as entertainment. They started creating memes from the disturbing photos, turning someone's tragedy into jokes and sharing them widely across platforms. The cruelest part was that these images and mocking content were being sent directly to family members of the person depicted. It was as if some people took pleasure in causing additional pain to those who were already suffering. This wasn't just about sharing disturbing content. It was deliberate psychological torture aimed at people who were desperately trying to understand what had happened to their loved one. Kim Devins was going about her normal Sunday routine when the unthinkable happened. She had no idea that across the internet, her daughter's name was trending for the most horrific reasons imaginable. Bianca was a talented young woman with artistic abilities and dreams of modeling. Kim knew her daughter had an active presence online, but like many parents, she didn't fully grasp the extent of her daughter's digital life. For Bianca, social media wasn't just a hobby. It was her primary way of connecting with the world and expressing herself. She had created multiple accounts across different platforms, each one representing different aspects of her personality. This wasn't unusual for someone her age, but for Bianca, these online spaces served as a refuge from the struggles she faced in her everyday life. Online, Bianca could be whoever she wanted to be. She could escape from her own problems and create an identity that felt more authentic to her than her real-world existence. She had built up a substantial following across her various accounts, and many of her online friends had become genuinely important people in her life. Bianca was particularly active on Discord, where she had gained popularity within several communities. She was known for her edgy aesthetic and artistic sensibilities, embodying what internet culture called the e-girl style, characterized by alternative fashion choices, creative makeup, and an overall rebellious appearance. But the same online spaces that provided Bianca with community and creative expression also exposed her to darker elements. Some platforms were known for hosting disturbing content and attracting users with questionable intentions. While Bianca tried to navigate these spaces carefully, she couldn't completely protect herself from their influence. That beautiful July morning in Utica, New York, started with the annual Boilermaker Road Race, a well-known 15K event that drew participants from around the world. As runners crossed the finish line and families celebrated, local police officers had no idea they were about to encounter one of the most disturbing cases they'd ever handle. The calls started coming in from concerned internet users who had seen the disturbing images. People from across the country were contacting authorities, unsure of what they had witnessed but certain that something terrible had happened. The callers didn't know if what they'd seen was real or fake, but they felt compelled to report it just in case. Police officers found themselves in an unusual situation, responding to reports of a possible crime based entirely on images circulating on social media. They had to determine whether these reports had any basis in reality or if they were dealing with an elaborate online hoax. As the calls continued to come in, all mentioning the same name, Bianca Michelle Devins, officers realized they needed to conduct a welfare check. They needed to find this young woman and confirm she was safe, if only to put an end to the disturbing rumors spreading online. When officers arrived at the Devins family home, they were equipped with body cameras that would record everything that followed. Bianca's younger sister Olivia answered the door, and the conversation that followed would change their family's life forever. "Is there a Bianca Devins that lives here?" the officers asked. When Olivia confirmed that yes, Bianca was her sister, she immediately called for her mother. Kim came to the door confused and concerned, wondering why police officers were asking about her daughter. The officers didn't show Kim the disturbing image that had been circulating online, but they explained that they had received reports suggesting her daughter might be in danger. They asked Kim to try to contact Bianca, hoping she would answer her phone and put an end to the growing concern. Kim's confusion deepened as she tried to process what the officers were telling her. She had last seen Bianca the day before when her daughter left for a concert in New York City. Bianca had been in an excellent mood, excited about attending what would be her first major concert as a young adult. Bianca had texted her mother after the concert to let her know she was heading home, just as any responsible teenager would do. She had been enjoying her newfound freedom after graduating from high school just 2 weeks earlier. After years of struggling with mental health issues, Bianca finally seemed to be in a good place and looking forward to starting college in the fall. But reaching Bianca proved impossible. Her phone went straight to voicemail, and she wasn't responding to any messages. As the hours passed and the disturbing images continued to spread online, it became increasingly clear that something had gone terribly wrong. Bianca's journey to that point hadn't been easy. She had first seen a therapist when she was just 9 years old, struggling with separation anxiety that made it difficult for her to attend school. She would cling to her mother, not wanting to be apart from her, and often had to be picked up from school early when the anxiety became overwhelming. Around age 13, Bianca's struggles intensified as she began showing signs of depression. She started isolating herself from friends and family, withdrawing from activities she had previously enjoyed. During this difficult period, she discovered the internet as a place where she could escape from her own mental struggles and create a different version of herself. Bianca became extremely active across multiple social media platforms, building up thousands of followers who were drawn to her artistic content and unique aesthetic. A journalist who later covered her story noted that Bianca perfectly embodied the e-girl phenomenon, a term used to describe young women with edgy, alternative styles who built followings online. As Bianca's behavior became increasingly erratic, her family sought professional help. At 16, she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a condition that her mother Kim believed explained many of Bianca's mood swings and struggles with self-image. Despite her challenges, Bianca was incredibly intelligent and self-aware, always knowing something was wrong and actively seeking help. Bianca's grandfather Frank watched as she sought treatment and gradually began to return to her role as a devoted big sister to Olivia and Maddie. The family could see their girl coming back to them. There was a brightness in her eyes when she talked about her plans for college and her future career goals. Bianca had immersed herself in her art and was even gaining recognition as a promising young model. She received compliments from modeling agents and felt genuinely good about herself when she was working in front of the camera. It seemed like she had finally turned a corner and was ready to build the life she had always dreamed of. By the time Bianca turned 17, she had developed several different online personas across various platforms. Each identity allowed her to explore different aspects of her personality and connect with different communities. But perhaps most concerning was her active participation on certain image boards that existed in the darker corners of the internet. One online friend later described these spaces as genuinely dangerous places that harbored extremely hostile attitudes toward women. These platforms were known for their anonymous users and lack of moderation, creating environments where disturbing content and misogynistic viewpoints could flourish unchecked. For a vulnerable young woman like Bianca, spending time in these spaces exposed her to people with potentially harmful intentions. As Bianca's online presence grew, so did her collection of male followers who became unhealthily fixated on her. These individuals, known in internet culture as orbiters, would follow attractive young women online, obsessing over them from a distance without ever forming genuine relationships. Elizabeth, one of Bianca's online friends, explained that these men would metaphorically orbit around the women they were attracted to, never getting truly close but never leaving their vicinity either. Bianca was remarkably patient with these followers, perhaps too patient for her own good. She would engage with them regularly, responding to their messages and treating them with kindness, even when their behavior became inappropriate or demanding. This accessibility made her popular within certain online communities, but it also attracted the attention of individuals who saw her kindness as something they were entitled to rather than a gift she chose to give. Among these orbiters was a 21-year-old rideshare driver named Brandon Clark, whom Bianca met through Instagram in May of 2019. To those who knew him from the online communities they both frequented, Brandon seemed unremarkable, just another socially awkward young man who spent too much time on the internet. He appeared to be one of many strange individuals who populated these digital spaces, nothing particularly notable or concerning about him at first glance. After connecting on social media, Brandon and Bianca eventually decided to meet in person and briefly attempted dating. However, Bianca was clear from the beginning about her boundaries and expectations. She explicitly told Brandon that she was not interested in an exclusive, committed relationship. At 17 and preparing for college, she wanted to keep her options open and focus on her future rather than settling into a serious romantic partnership. Brandon appeared to accept these terms initially, at least outwardly. When he began visiting Bianca's family home regularly, he presented himself as understanding and respectful of her wishes. To Bianca's mother, Kim, Brandon seemed like a harmless, nerdy young man who genuinely cared about her daughter's well-being. Kim found Brandon to be polite and considerate during his visits. He came across as the archetypal boy next door, perhaps a bit awkward and goofy, but fundamentally decent. There were no obvious warning signs that suggested he might be dangerous or possessive. His behavior around the family was consistently respectful, and he seemed to genuinely enjoy spending time with Bianca without making unreasonable demands. When Bianca mentioned that Brandon would be accompanying her to a concert in New York City, Kim actually felt relieved. After everything her daughter had been through with her mental health struggles, Kim was comforted by the idea that Bianca wouldn't be attending her first major adult concert alone. Having Brandon there seemed like a safety measure rather than a cause for concern. But as the disturbing images continued to circulate online that July morning, Bianca's friends began to piece together a horrifying puzzle. When they learned that it was Brandon Clark himself who had posted the original image, their initial reaction was disbelief and hope that this was all some kind of elaborate, cruel joke. Discord communities were unfortunately familiar with users posting graphic or disturbing content simply to provoke reactions from other members. Some people seemed to take pleasure in sharing shocking images just to see how others would respond. Given this context, Bianca's friends desperately hoped that Brandon was just trying to scare them or get attention through this disturbing post. But their hopes were quickly shattered when the situation escalated beyond anything they could have imagined. The joke theory became impossible to maintain when Brandon himself called emergency services, identifying himself and providing details that made the horror undeniably real. "My name is Brandon," he told the emergency dispatcher. "The victim is Bianca Michelle Devins." The casual way he provided this information, as if he were reporting a minor incident rather than a tragedy, chilled everyone who heard it. But even more disturbing was what he said next. "I'm going to kill myself." For Kim and her family, waiting anxiously at home while police tried to locate Bianca, hearing this information over the officers' radios was devastating. The police at their home could hear the communications from other units, and the family learned in real time that Brandon was claiming to be suicidal and admitting that he had harmed Bianca. Kim struggled to process this information. The Brandon she knew didn't seem capable of violence. The polite, respectful young man who had visited her home regularly and seemed to care so much about her daughter's well-being. It simply didn't make sense that he could have hurt Bianca. The disconnect between the Brandon she thought she knew and the person on the radio confessing to harming her daughter was almost impossible to reconcile. Meanwhile, investigators were working frantically to locate Brandon before he could harm himself or potentially hurt anyone else. He had posted additional disturbing images of Bianca online, including one with the message, "I'm sorry, Bianca." The urgency of the situation was clear. They needed to find both Brandon and Bianca as quickly as possible. The emergency dispatcher tried desperately to keep Brandon on the line, hoping to trace his location and guide police to him. But Brandon was uncooperative, refusing to stay on the call and making it clear that he had no intention of being taken alive. "I'm not going to stay on the line with you," he told the dispatcher. "I'm going to be dead on the ground." However, before hanging up, Brandon did provide one crucial piece of information. He told them exactly where they could find him. He was parked on a dead-end road not far from Bianca's home, waiting for police to arrive and seemingly preparing for a final confrontation. When officers located Brandon's vehicle, they found him armed with a knife and clearly agitated. He was standing near his car, and the responding officer could see that he was dangerous and unpredictable. The officer drew his weapon and tried to communicate with Brandon, repeatedly ordering him to drop the knife and comply with commands. The conversation between the officer and Brandon was tense and surreal. "Where's the girl? Where is she?" the officer demanded, trying to locate Bianca while simultaneously managing the threat that Brandon posed. But Brandon was more focused on his own dramatic finale than on providing helpful information. As the officer moved into position and backup units rushed to the scene, Brandon made good on his threats of self-harm. He slashed himself with the knife, creating wounds that were serious but not immediately fatal. But even in this moment of supposed desperation and regret, Brandon's narcissistic tendencies showed through. He paused to take a selfie of his injured state and posted it to social media with the caption, "Ashes to ashes." The responding officers were eventually able to disarm Brandon and take him into custody after a brief struggle. As paramedics worked to treat his self-inflicted wounds and prepare him for transport to the hospital, investigators made the discovery that confirmed everyone's worst fears. Hidden beneath a tarp near Brandon's vehicle, they found the body of a young woman. Even before any official identification could be made, the responding officers knew they had found Bianca. The vibrant, artistic 17-year-old who had been looking forward to starting college and helping others with their mental health struggles was gone. The news of this discovery needed to be communicated to Bianca's family, but before police could make that official notification, Kim and her daughters learned the truth in the most brutal way possible. Someone had sent the horrific image directly to members of Bianca's family via text message. Olivia was in the kitchen with a friend when she received the message. The scream that followed was unlike anything anyone in the house had ever heard, a sound of pure anguish and disbelief that came from the depths of a teenager's soul as she realized what had happened to her beloved sister. Kim's reaction was a mixture of denial and desperate hope. "It's not her, it's not her, it's not my baby," she kept repeating, as if saying it enough times could somehow make it true. But even as she denied what she was seeing, a part of her knew that her worst nightmare had become reality. Despite her shock and grief, Kim forced herself to remain strong for her surviving daughters. She knew that Olivia and Maddie would need her to hold the family together through whatever came next. "I'm going to be strong and get my family through this," she told herself, even as her world was crumbling around her. For investigators, this wasn't a question of who had committed this terrible crime. Brandon had made his guilt clear through his own admissions and actions. Instead, they needed to work backward from the crime scene to understand why this had happened and what had driven Brandon to take such a drastic and violent action. The prosecution team that would handle the case began their investigation at the crime scene itself, where they discovered that every detail had been carefully planned and staged by Brandon. Nothing about this crime was spontaneous or accidental. It had been orchestrated with disturbing precision. One of the first clues they found was a cryptic message that Brandon had spray-painted at the scene. "May you never forget me." When investigators researched this phrase, they discovered it was taken from a series of Japanese manga called Poon Poon that Brandon and Bianca had read together. These comics were known for their dark, violent themes and had been described as a twisted version of Romeo and Juliet. This discovery raised disturbing questions about how Brandon viewed his relationship with Bianca. Did he see himself as part of some tragic love story, with their deaths serving as the climax of a doomed romance? The reference suggested that Brandon had constructed an elaborate fantasy around their relationship that bore little resemblance to reality. But perhaps even more chilling was another element investigators discovered at the crime scene. Brandon had used a Bluetooth speaker to program his phone to play a specific song on repeat throughout the incident. The song was Test Drive by Joji, which tells the story of someone who is far more invested in a relationship than their partner is. The choice of this particular song seemed to perfectly capture Brandon's mindset. He had convinced himself that he deserved more from Bianca than she was willing or able to give, and he had turned his disappointment into justification for violence. To understand the events that led to this tragedy, investigators began examining the social media accounts and digital communications of both Brandon and Bianca. What they discovered was that the two hadn't attended the concert alone, as many people had assumed. There had been a third person with them, another young man named Alex whom Bianca had met through Discord. Direct messages from Bianca's accounts revealed that she had invited Alex to meet them at the concert and had been worried about how Brandon might react to this arrangement. She was concerned that Brandon might become jealous, despite the fact that she had been clear about not wanting an exclusive relationship with him. When investigators tracked down Alex, he was cooperative and provided valuable insight into the dynamics between Bianca and Brandon that night. He confirmed that Brandon had seemed unhappy about his presence from the beginning and had made his displeasure obvious throughout the evening. The investigation revealed that after the concert, Bianca had sent a message to Alex saying, "I think he saw me kiss you." This simple text message would prove to be crucial in understanding what had triggered Brandon's violent response. The kiss between Bianca and Alex, a normal interaction between two young people who were attracted to each other, had apparently been the catalyst for the horror that followed. Investigators had to determine whether this had been a crime of passion, triggered by Brandon witnessing something that made him lose control in the moment, or whether there had been more deliberate planning involved. The answer to this question would be crucial in understanding both Brandon's mindset and the appropriate charges he should face. As Brandon and Bianca drove back toward Utica in the early morning hours, Brandon made an ominous post on social media. He shared a photograph of what appeared to be the New York State Thruway with the caption, "Here comes hell. It's redemption, right?" This post, made while Bianca was likely sleeping in the car beside him, suggested that Brandon had already made his decision about what was going to happen next. Even as investigators worked to piece together the timeline of events from that tragic night, nothing could have prepared them for the most horrifying discovery they would make during their investigation. The forensic analysis of Brandon Clark's cell phone revealed something that transformed this case from a straightforward murder into something far more disturbing and calculated. The morning after Bianca's murder, prosecutors received an urgent call from the police department. They were told there was something crucial they needed to see immediately, something that would fundamentally change their understanding of what had happened. The forensic team had been working through the night analyzing Brandon's phone, and what they had uncovered was beyond anything they had anticipated. When the prosecutors arrived at the police station, they were set up with a computer, speakers, and headphones. The technicians prepared to show them evidence that would prove to be the most disturbing thing either of them had ever encountered in their legal careers. What they were about to witness was a video that Brandon had recorded of himself murdering Bianca. The realization that such footage existed hit the prosecution team like a physical blow. This wasn't just a crime that had been committed in a moment of rage or passion. It had been deliberately documented by the perpetrator himself. The video evidence revealed a level of premeditation and callousness that was difficult for even experienced prosecutors to comprehend. In the recording, Bianca appeared to be sleeping peacefully in the back seat of Brandon's car. The rear seats had been folded down to create a flat surface, suggesting that Brandon had planned for this moment well in advance. He had positioned his camera by clipping it to one of the air vents on the front dashboard, carefully angling it to capture what was about to unfold. The video showed Brandon reaching into the back seat area and retrieving a knife that he had hidden there earlier. This detail was crucial for investigators because it proved that Brandon had come prepared for violence. The weapon wasn't something he had grabbed in the heat of the moment, but rather a tool he had brought specifically for this purpose. After securing the knife and hiding it from Bianca's view, Brandon proceeded to wake her up. What followed was a conversation that would haunt everyone who heard it. Brandon confronted Bianca directly about the kiss she had shared with Alex at the concert earlier that evening. "You know I saw you kiss him, right?" Brandon asked her. Bianca, still groggy from sleep and probably confused about why they had stopped driving, acknowledged what had happened. "Yeah, and I'm sorry," she responded, perhaps thinking that a simple apology would be enough to smooth things over between them. But Brandon's response revealed the depth of his obsession and entitlement. "Well, I'm sorry, but that's not good enough for me," he told her. His words carried an ominous finality that Bianca probably didn't fully grasp in that moment. It was then that Bianca reminded Brandon of something she had made clear many times before. They were not in an exclusive relationship. She had the right to kiss whomever she wanted, just as he did. After reiterating this point, she asked a simple question that showed she was ready to move on from this conversation. "Are you ready to take me home yet?" For Brandon, this question seemed to crystallize his worst fears. He realized that this might indeed be the end of his time with Bianca, that she was ready to go home and continue living her life without him. Rather than accepting her autonomy and her right to make her own choices, Brandon made a decision that would destroy both their lives. The video captured the moment when Brandon reached for the knife, moving quickly so that Bianca wouldn't see what was coming. She had no opportunity to defend herself or escape because she never saw the attack coming. Brandon had used their conversation as a distraction while he prepared to commit murder. After the attack, Brandon's behavior became even more disturbing. Instead of showing remorse or calling for help, he turned the camera toward himself and began screaming dramatically at Bianca's motionless form. "Bianca, why did you make me do this?" he yelled, as if she were somehow responsible for his decision to kill her. This victim blaming, captured on his own recording, revealed the twisted logic that had driven him to violence. It was only after he had finished recording the murder that Brandon took the graphic photographs of Bianca's body and posted them on social media. The calculated nature of these actions, first filming the crime, then photographing the aftermath, then sharing it online, showed a level of premeditation that was chilling to investigators. Bianca's mother, Kim, was haunted by the knowledge of how close she had been when her daughter was killed. She lived just 10 minutes away from where the murder occurred. If Bianca had somehow been able to escape from the car, she could have called her mother for help and might still be alive today. The fact that Brandon had caught her completely off guard, using their conversation as cover for his attack, made Kim's grief even more profound. Despite being ambushed and having no warning of what was coming, investigators learned that Bianca had fought back against her attacker. This detail brought some small comfort to her family, particularly her grandfather Frank, who was proud that she had battled for her life even in those final, terrifying moments. But the murder video wasn't the only evidence of premeditation that investigators found on Brandon's phone. Their analysis revealed that he had been planning this crime for much longer than anyone had initially realized. Brandon wasn't someone who had simply snapped in a moment of jealousy. He was someone who had been methodically preparing for violence. 2 days before the murder, Brandon had used the Notes app on his smartphone to create what investigators described as a to-do list for carrying out his plan. The list included details about staging the crime scene, setting up speakers for music, and other elements that showed he had thought through every aspect of what he intended to do. The evidence showed that Brandon had also conducted multiple internet searches in the days leading up to the murder, researching various methods of killing someone. He had looked up information about how to choke someone unconscious and how to cut major arteries to cause fatal bleeding. These searches provided additional proof that the murder had been planned well in advance. For investigators and prosecutors, this evidence painted a clear picture of who Brandon Clark really was. This wasn't a crime of passion committed by someone who had lost control in a moment of emotional distress. This was a calculated murder committed by someone who had decided that if he couldn't have Bianca on his terms, then no one else could have her either. The prosecution team believed that Brandon had always intended to kill Bianca when their relationship ended, regardless of how or when that ending came about. He wanted to be with her exclusively, and when she made it clear that she wasn't interested in that kind of relationship, he decided that she would have to die. The kiss with Alex had simply provided him with the excuse he needed to carry out a plan he had already been developing. Brandon was officially charged with second-degree murder and pleaded not guilty. Before the judge delivered the sentence, he was given one last chance to speak. He said he hated himself for what he had done and expressed regret for putting everyone through such pain. He claimed he wished he could apologize to Bianca directly and undo his actions. But Bianca's family did not believe him. To them, his words felt hollow, just another performance, another attempt to paint himself as the victim. They felt his supposed remorse was not truly for what he had done to Bianca, but for the consequences he now had to face. The judge seemed to share their doubts. Believing Brandon's apology lacked sincerity, the court imposed the maximum penalty, 25 years to life in prison. While the sentence was significant, Bianca's family knew their battle was not entirely over. After 25 years, Brandon would be eligible for parole. By then, he would still be in his late 40s with the possibility of decades of freedom ahead of him. For Bianca's loved ones, the ruling was not justice in its fullest form. It was simply the closest the system could come. No sentence, no number of years could ever bring her back. What remained was a life shattered by loss, a family forced to carry a grief that would never truly fade. And while Brandon would one day face the possibility of walking free, Bianca's story had ended forever at just 17 years old. It started with smoke rising from a mansion in one of Washington, D.C.'s richest neighborhoods. But inside, the fire wasn't the real horror. For people were already dead. A successful CEO, his wife, their 10-year-old son, and the family's housekeeper. They'd been tied up, tortured, and brutally murdered before the killer set the house ablaze to hide the evidence. What kind of person looks into the eyes of a child and sets his bed on fire? The phones were cut. The alarms never triggered. The family dogs were left outside, silent witnesses to a nightmare. And then came the strangest clue: a half-eaten pizza, carelessly left behind. That one piece of DNA exposed a shocking truth. The killer wasn't a stranger. He was someone the family once trusted. This is the story of the D.C. Mansion murders, a night of terror, greed, and cruelty that still chills the city to its core. In the heart of Washington, D.C., during the warm days of May 2015, 46-year-old Savas began what seemed like an ordinary Wednesday morning. He had built an impressive reputation as the head of American Iron Works, a thriving construction company specializing in custom building materials and installation services throughout the Washington area. Those who knew him described a man who filled every room he entered, with infectious energy and a booming laugh that could be heard across any gathering. He lived by a simple philosophy: work hard, but never forget to enjoy life along the way. His love story with Amy began in high school. Amy Martin had caught his attention early on, and Savas never made it a secret that she was the only woman he could imagine spending his life with. Their relationship blossomed at university, and after graduation, they celebrated with a traditional Greek wedding ceremony. Over the years, they welcomed 3 children: daughters Abigail and Katerina, now 19 and 16, and their 10-year-old son Philip. After completing his law degree, Savas joined the family business alongside his father, expanding American Iron Works into the successful enterprise it had become. The family had earned their place among the well-respected members of their community through years of hard work and genuine care for others. They lived in a stunning mansion on Woodland Drive, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the area, a street that had been home to former vice presidents and foreign ambassadors. What truly set Savas apart was his character. Both he and Amy believed strongly in giving back, dedicating not just money but time to causes they cared about. Savas served on the board of directors for the National Child Research Center, while Amy was a beloved presence at their children's schools, known for elaborate gingerbread house decorating sessions and never hesitating to volunteer. With both older daughters away at boarding schools, the family's magnificent home had taken on a quieter atmosphere. Amy had been reconnecting with old friends, organizing gatherings, while Savas poured energy into an exciting new business venture. 10-year-old Philip had discovered his passion in go-kart racing, spending countless hours at various tracks with his coach, developing skills that showed real promise. The entire family embraced his passion, traveling to support him at races and celebrating his victories together. However, during his most recent race on May 3rd, something had gone wrong, resulting in a concerning accident that left Philip with a concussion. After thorough medical evaluation, doctors assured the family that while Philip needed rest and monitoring, there was no reason for serious concern. This meant Philip had been staying home from school, with Amy as his primary caretaker during recovery. Working for the family was Vera, whose full name was Veralicia but who was affectionately known as Nellie throughout the household. She had been with them for an incredible 20 years, truly becoming part of their extended family. About 5 years earlier, she had introduced another housekeeper to the household, a woman also named Vera. This second Vera had proven equally dedicated and trustworthy, using her earnings to support her children pursuing college educations in El Salvador. She had been looking forward to taking a well-deserved break soon, planning to return to her home country with her husband Bernardo and officially retire the following year. On Wednesday morning, May 13th, Amy and Philip made a trip to the doctor's office for a follow-up appointment. While Amy was taking care of Philip's medical needs, Savas was focused on his latest business project, opening a martial arts studio in Virginia with a grand opening scheduled for just a few days away. For the final preparations, he had asked Nellie to accompany him to ensure everything was perfect. At 4:25 that afternoon, Amy received a call from a local dog-sitting service. The employee who called knew Amy well, which made it particularly noticeable that her demeanor seemed different than usual. Instead of her typically warm and talkative personality, Amy sounded tired and distant, as if she might be coming down with something. As 5 o'clock approached, Savas received a phone call from Amy. After ending the call, he told Nellie that he needed to return home immediately to take care of Philip, explaining that Amy had made arrangements to go out for the evening. At that moment, Amy was at home with the second housekeeper, Vera. However, Vera's workday was supposed to have ended much earlier, and she was already well past her normal departure time. Savas returned home as planned, while Nellie concluded her work at the martial arts studio and headed to her own home. As the evening progressed, Bernardo found himself growing increasingly worried about his wife's whereabouts. Vera's shift was supposed to have ended at 3 o'clock, and her failure to return home or make contact was completely out of character. He tried calling her repeatedly, but after several attempts, the phone stopped ringing altogether. Despite his concern, Bernardo had his own work obligations to fulfill, scheduled for the overnight shift. He tried to convince himself there must be a reasonable explanation, though worry continued to gnaw at him. Just before 6 o'clock that evening, the security company monitoring the mansion's alarm system received an automated alert indicating that glass had been broken somewhere on the property. However, when they investigated, everything appeared normal. Savas himself spoke with representatives, asking specific questions about how he could access recorded footage from their surveillance system. Following this security call, Savas attempted to reach his personal assistant and driver, Jordan Wallace, who had been working for him for only a couple of months. When Jordan didn't answer, Savas left a detailed voicemail instructing him to retrieve a specific package from the American Iron Works offices for delivery the following morning. At 9 o'clock, Amy made a call to a local Domino's pizza location, ordering 2 pepperoni pizzas and paying over the phone. Before ending the call, she gave specific instructions that would later seem significant. She told the delivery person to ring the doorbell but then simply leave the food by the front door rather than waiting for someone to answer, explaining that she was caring for a sick child and didn't want to disturb him. About 35 minutes later, Savas made another important call, leaving a voicemail for Nellie. The content was highly unusual given their normal routine. He told Nellie not to come to work the next day as planned, explaining that Amy had become ill and that Vera had offered to stay overnight to help care for her, something that had never happened before. He mentioned that Vera's phone battery had died and they didn't have the right charger, which was why he was calling himself. He asked Nellie to send a text confirming she received the message. When the Domino's driver arrived, he followed Amy's instructions exactly, placing the pizza boxes by the front door and finding an envelope with his tip near the doormat. As he completed the delivery, he couldn't help but notice several unusual details. The porch light was on, but the interior appeared completely dark. More notably, the entire property seemed unusually quiet, with no sounds of conversation, television, or any typical household activity. The driver collected his payment and continued with his deliveries, having no way of knowing something horrific was unfolding inside. Savas made another call to Jordan with a very unusual and urgent request. He needed $40,000 in cash withdrawn from the company's accounts immediately and delivered to Jordan as quickly as possible. This was an extraordinary amount on such short notice. Jordan collected both the original package and the substantial cash, then set off toward the mansion. However, Savas's instructions were quite specific and different from normal procedures. Rather than knocking on the door, Savas told Jordan to simply place both items inside one of the family sports cars in the driveway. He also told Jordan not to attempt contact with anyone in the house, explaining he would be busy with conference calls. Instead, Jordan should proceed to the martial arts studio, where Savas would meet him shortly. As the following morning dawned, neighbors noticed something unusual. All the family's vehicles remained parked in the driveway, distinctly different from their normal pattern. When 9:30 arrived, Bernardo finally returned home from his overnight shift, hoping to find Vera waiting. Instead, he discovered she still hadn't returned. What had been concern transformed into full panic. Unable to wait any longer, Bernardo drove directly to the mansion to find out what was happening. Just before 10 o'clock, Nellie received a text from Amy stating clearly that she should not come to work that day. This arrived almost the exact moment Nellie was listening to Savas's voicemail for the first time. As she listened carefully, she immediately noticed things that seemed wrong. Savas's voice sounded unusually strained and nervous, completely different from his normal confident tone. Even more disturbing, she could hear what sounded like shouting or raised voices in the background. The most unusual aspect was Savas's claim that Vera would be staying overnight. In all the years both women had worked for the family, neither had ever spent the night at the mansion. The feeling that she wasn't getting the complete truth became overwhelming. Nellie tried calling Amy's phone directly, but her call went unanswered. She sent a text expressing concern, but received no response whatsoever. When Bernardo arrived at the house, he encountered the same frustrating silence. He pressed the doorbell repeatedly and knocked loudly, calling out for Vera. Although he couldn't hear clear voices, he had the distinct feeling that people were definitely present. Strange sounds came from inside that didn't match a normal household morning routine. He heard what seemed like shuffling footsteps and quiet murmuring, as if people were moving around but trying to keep voices low. The family's dogs were making noise, their barking seeming more agitated than normal. Most unsettling, Bernardo heard what sounded like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor. Just as Bernardo was becoming more confused and worried, his phone suddenly rang. To his surprise, it was Savas calling directly. Savas immediately began apologizing profusely for not contacting him the night before. He explained that Vera had stayed overnight with the family, and that Amy had become quite ill. Now Vera had accompanied Amy to the hospital, which was why Vera wasn't available to speak directly. What made this conversation particularly strange was that Savas was clearly inside the house, just on the other side of the door. If everything was normal, there seemed no logical reason why he couldn't simply open the door and have a face-to-face conversation. Despite these strange circumstances, Bernardo felt somewhat relieved to have finally heard from someone. He tried to convince himself he had been overthinking the situation. After ending the call, he drove back home, expecting to see Vera later that day. Around this same time, Jordan arrived at the mansion to complete his delivery. Following specific instructions, he placed both the package and the $40,000 inside one of the sports cars. He then returned to his vehicle without attempting contact with anyone inside. At exactly 10:26, Jordan sent Savas a text confirming successful delivery. He remained in his car for a few minutes, watching his phone. He could see the dots indicating someone was typing a response, but they would disappear without any message being sent. This pattern repeated several times, as if someone was starting to write something but then changing their mind. Eventually, Jordan realized no reply was coming, so he left. At 1:30 that afternoon, everything changed dramatically when residents throughout the neighborhood began calling emergency services to report a massive fire on Woodland Drive. The mansion was completely engulfed in flames, spreading with frightening speed. When firefighters arrived and began battling the intense blaze, they made a heartbreaking discovery. The family's dogs had somehow managed to escape and were found outside, distressed but not physically injured. However, as firefighters worked to control the flames and eventually gained access to the interior, they found four people inside. In one bedroom, they discovered Savas, Amy, and Vera. In an adjacent room, they found 10-year-old Philip. The condition of Philip's body was so severely damaged that responding personnel initially couldn't even determine basic identifying information. Savas, Amy, and Philip were all found deceased. However, Vera was discovered still alive, though barely clinging to life with horrific injuries. Emergency personnel rushed her to the hospital immediately, where doctors worked desperately to save her. Despite their best efforts and advanced medical care, Vera's injuries were too severe, and she passed away from the trauma she had endured. The medical examinations that followed revealed the full horror. All 4 victims had been subjected to brutal physical assault using a baseball bat. They had been suffocated and strangled. They had been tied up and restrained. Each had also been stabbed with sharp weapons. The specific injuries to Savas and Amy were determined to be from both blunt force trauma and sharp force trauma, indicating they had been beaten and stabbed repeatedly. Philip had endured these same injuries, and had additionally been attacked with what appeared to be a samurai sword. Most tragically, evidence suggested Philip may have still been alive when the fire was started in his bedroom, meaning he may have died from the flames rather than from his other injuries, though his condition was too severely damaged to reach a definitive conclusion. Investigation revealed that all 4 victims had been doused with gasoline before the fire was set. The blaze had been deliberately started in Philip's bedroom and allowed to spread throughout the house. Both Amy and Vera were found with residue from duct tape on their wrists, indicating they had been bound during their ordeal. Savas showed evidence of having been restrained as well, possibly with zip ties. The autopsy results confirmed that everyone in that house had been systematically tortured over an extended period. The level of violence and cruelty was difficult even for experienced professionals to process. The community was left searching for answers that seemed impossible to find. Law enforcement provided very little information about possible motives or suspects. Crime scene investigators immediately began focusing on the security system. Multiple surveillance cameras had been installed around the property, but investigators believed whoever was responsible had deliberately disabled these cameras. This suggested the perpetrators were familiar with the family's security setup and routines, leading investigators to believe this was not a random attack. Physical evidence began to tell the story. A single window on the side of the house had been broken, apparently serving as the entry point. The telephone lines had been deliberately cut, preventing victims from calling for help. A boot print was discovered on one of the doors, suggesting it had been kicked in during the attack. This footprint didn't match boots worn by firefighters, confirming it was related to the original crime. Investigators also found a knife wedged into the broken window frame, apparently used to prop the window open and provide a way to observe the driveway. Perhaps most significantly, the computer storing all recorded footage from the home's surveillance system had been completely removed from its location in the attic. While the keyboard and wires remained, the actual computer had been stolen and would never be recovered. This represented crucial evidence that could have provided definitive answers about who was responsible. Most neighbors reported they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. However, a few residents provided important information. Around noon on the day of the fire, approximately 90 minutes before the house went up in flames, a couple of neighbors reported seeing a middle-aged black man with dreadlocks entering the family's garage area. What was particularly notable was that the man didn't appear to be forcing his way in. The door seemed to open easily, suggesting either he had legitimate access or someone inside was cooperating under duress. Another crucial piece of evidence was the disappearance of one of the family's vehicles. A blue 2008 Porsche registered to the family had been visible in the driveway earlier but was nowhere to be found after the fire began. Traffic cameras captured footage of this Porsche traveling east toward Maryland shortly after the mansion began burning, strongly suggesting it had been used as a getaway vehicle. Law enforcement eventually located the missing Porsche, but it had been deliberately set on fire in the back of a church parking lot. Surveillance footage from the church showed a figure running away from the burning vehicle, dressed in dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be a white box. Unfortunately, the quality of the footage made it impossible to identify specific details about this person. When investigators examined the burned Porsche, they made an important discovery. Inside the vehicle, they found a green construction vest that had somehow survived the fire in relatively good condition. This piece of evidence was immediately sent for DNA testing, as it might provide crucial information about who had been wearing it. As the investigation deepened, another disturbing piece of information came to light. A second employee of the family came forward to report that she had received a text message from Amy just hours before the fire began. The message, sent at 9:56 in the morning, specifically instructed this employee to stay away from the house that day. The timing was particularly significant, suggesting Amy was being forced to send communications to prevent anyone from discovering what was happening inside. Despite the extensive fire damage, investigators were surprised to find that a significant amount of cash had been left behind in the house, along with valuable artwork, jewelry, and other expensive items that would typically be targeted in a robbery. This raised important questions about the true motive, since financial gain didn't appear to be the primary objective. One of the most significant pieces of evidence recovered was a partially eaten pizza that had somehow avoided fire damage. Investigators learned that Amy had placed the order at 9 o'clock the previous evening, requesting delivery to the house. However, given the timeline and condition of the victims, it seemed highly unlikely that Amy herself had eaten the pizza. The logical conclusion was that whoever was holding the family captive had forced Amy to place the order and had then consumed the food themselves. This gave investigators hope they might recover DNA evidence from the leftover pizza crusts, which were immediately sent for testing. While investigators worked to piece together physical evidence, the surviving family members dealt with unimaginable grief in the public eye. 19-year-old Katerina, who had been away at boarding school, began posting heartfelt tributes to her lost family on social media. Her message to her father was deeply personal, expressing how he had always been her hero and role model. She thanked him for teaching her important values like courage and loyalty. The tribute to her mother was equally touching, using a phrase that had apparently been regular in their conversations. "In a while, crocodile." Her message about little brother Philip was brief but heartbreaking, saying she would do anything to see his smile again. The community came together to say goodbye to 3 of the 4 victims at St. Sophia Greek Orthodox Cathedral. One by one, 3 caskets were slowly carried up the church steps as mourners gathered to pay respects. The ceremony focused on celebrating the family's dedication to their community and commitment to charitable causes. Among the mourners were Katerina and Abigail, now orphaned and forced to face the world without their parents and little brother. The 4th victim, Vera, would be honored separately, her body being prepared for transport back to her native El Salvador, where she would be buried according to her family's wishes. As forensic testing continued, investigators received news that would break the case wide open. The DNA analysis of the pizza crusts had yielded a positive result. The saliva found on the leftover food matched the genetic profile of someone already in the law enforcement database. The decision to carefully preserve the pizza rather than disposing of it had proven crucial. On May 20th, exactly 1 week after the murders, law enforcement issued an arrest warrant for 34-year-old Darren Dennis Wint. He was officially charged with first-degree murder and considered extremely dangerous. A massive manhunt began immediately, with agencies across multiple states coordinating efforts to locate and apprehend the suspect. The search extended beyond Washington, D.C. as investigators followed leads about his possible whereabouts. The New York Police Department began distributing wanted posters throughout Brooklyn, where they believed he might be hiding, possibly with his girlfriend. The official description provided specific details to help the public identify him. Darren was described as a black male with dark complexion, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighing around 155 pounds. The last confirmed sighting had him wearing blue jeans, a blue hooded sweatshirt, and white tennis shoes. Specialized fugitive task forces searched multiple locations throughout Maryland, following up on tips and information. Based on recent intelligence, investigators believed he had fled to the Brooklyn area, prompting New York Police Department involvement. The DNA evidence against Darren was overwhelming and found in multiple locations. His genetic material had been recovered from the knife wedged in the window frame, from locations inside the house, and from the green construction vest found in the burned Porsche. The fact that his DNA was present in so many places made it virtually impossible to claim he hadn't been involved. The location where the Porsche was found burning also provided additional evidence. The church parking lot was only a 2-minute walk from an apartment complex where Darren had previously lived, suggesting he chose this location because he was familiar with the area. As investigators dug deeper into Darren's background, they uncovered information providing a possible motive. About 10 years earlier, Darren had been employed as a welder at Savis's company, American Iron Works. Colleagues described Savis as someone who made genuine efforts to know all his employees personally, treating them more like friends than simply workers. Darren had initially been one of these employees, but his employment came to an abrupt end when he was terminated for threatening a coworker with a knife. This violent incident cost him his job and apparently created lasting resentment toward Savis and the company. After losing his position, Darren struggled to maintain steady employment. In 2008 and 2009, he actually contacted the company asking to be given a second chance and rehired. However, given the circumstances of his termination and the threat against another employee, the company refused to bring him back. In addition to his work at the company, Darren had also occasionally performed maintenance and repair work around the family's mansion. This meant he was familiar with the layout of the house, the family's routines, and their security systems, giving him significant advantages in planning and carrying out the attack. Just one day after the warrant was announced publicly, at 11 o'clock in the evening, authorities finally tracked him down. He was found in a truck traveling with 3 other people, having been on the run since seeing his name and photograph broadcast on news programs. During his time as a fugitive, Darren had gone to extraordinary lengths to evade capture, even taking a taxi from Washington, D.C. to New York City. However, his own girlfriend ultimately played a role in his capture when she contacted police to inform them of his possible whereabouts. When officers apprehended Darren, they made an interesting discovery inside the vehicle. $100 bills were scattered throughout the truck, suggesting he still had access to significant cash, possibly from the $40,000 delivered to the mansion. After an intensive 48-hour manhunt covering more than 400 miles, United States Marshals finally located Darren at a Howard Johnson hotel in College Park, Maryland. He had checked into room 412, just a few miles from the scene of the original crime. The proximity of his hiding place to the mansion suggested either poor planning or a psychological compulsion to remain near where he had committed his crimes. Following his arrest, the surviving family members released a public statement expressing gratitude to law enforcement for their diligent work. While they acknowledged his arrest couldn't diminish their pain and grief, they hoped it would help restore a sense of safety and security to their neighborhood and community. Darren was formally charged with first-degree felony murder while armed and scheduled to appear in court. As investigators worked to reconstruct the timeline, they believed Darren had entered the mansion sometime around 3:30 in the afternoon on May 13th. The exact method he used to gain entry remained unclear. It was possible Amy had recognized him from his previous work around the house and admitted him willingly, or he might have forced his way inside through deception or intimidation. The knife found wedged in the window frame was believed to have been placed there after he'd already gained access, creating a vantage point to observe the driveway and watch for Jordan's arrival with the money. When Savis returned home that evening, expecting to care for his son while Amy went out, he instead walked into a nightmare scenario. Everyone in the house had already been taken captive and restrained by Darren. What followed was a 19-hour ordeal of torture and terror that would end with the deaths of all 4 victims. Despite the fact that the family cooperated fully with demands, never attempted to raise an alarm, and even arranged delivery of the $40,000 requested, Darren still chose to murder them in the most brutal manner possible. This decision to kill the victims even after receiving what he wanted demonstrated a level of cruelty and callousness difficult for investigators and prosecutors to comprehend. When Darren's case went to trial, he was charged with first-degree murder while armed and held without possibility of bail. Eventually, charges against him would expand to include 20 separate counts. However, Darren maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense strategy centered around blaming his brothers, Daryl and Stephen, for the actual crimes. Darren claimed that while he had been present at the house, he remained in a separate room and was unaware of what his brothers were doing to the victims. This defense required the jury to believe he had somehow been oblivious to a 19-hour torture session taking place in the same house. Perhaps even more surprisingly, Darren's legal team attempted to challenge the DNA evidence that had been crucial in identifying him as the perpetrator. His lawyer made the remarkable argument that despite Darren's DNA being found on pizza crusts, this evidence should be dismissed because Darren supposedly didn't like pizza and never ate it. The defense went so far as to characterize DNA analysis as junk science, despite its well-established scientific validity and acceptance in courts throughout the world. However, legal experts pointed out the flaws in this defense strategy. Regardless of whether pizza was Darren's favorite food, the fact remained that his DNA had been found at multiple locations throughout the crime scene. The defense team struggled to provide any innocent explanation for why Darren's genetic material would be present in the victim's home, especially given his history as a disgruntled former employee who had previous conflicts with Savas. The prosecution emphasized that Darren had both motive and opportunity to commit these crimes. His termination from American Iron Works after threatening a coworker, his subsequent requests to be rehired, and his familiarity with the family's home and routines all contributed to a compelling case for his guilt. Additionally, his extensive criminal record, which included domestic violence and assault convictions, was entirely consistent with the type of violence inflicted on the victims. More than 3 years after the murders, in 2018, Darren's trial finally began. The 7-week proceeding featured numerous witnesses and expert testimony as prosecutors presented their case. One particularly important witness was the director of reservations at a pet boarding facility the family used regularly. She testified that on May 13th, her staff called the house at 3:14 in the afternoon to confirm an upcoming reservation. However, when they tried to reach the family through their landline, they discovered the phone had been disconnected. Throughout that day, the boarding facility staff left multiple voice messages on Amy's cell phone. The witness described how Amy's voice sounded different than usual during their conversations, seeming sleepy, rushed, and unlike her normally chatty and engaging self. Prosecutors argued this change in demeanor was evidence that she was already being held hostage and forced to participate in phone calls under duress. When Jordan took the stand to testify, he admitted he had taken a photograph of the money, but maintained he had no involvement whatsoever in planning or executing the murders. He explained he had simply been shocked to find himself carrying such a large amount of cash and wanted to document the unusual nature of his assignment. Law enforcement had conducted their own thorough investigation into Jordan's potential involvement and ultimately concluded he was not connected to the murders. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence presented during trial was video footage taken inside the mansion in the days following the murders. This haunting footage gave the jury their first look at the interior of the home and the devastating aftermath. The images showed charred bedrooms and the burned remains of furniture, including the metal coils that were all that remained of the bed where 10-year-old Philip had been found. As the jury watched this disturbing footage, court observers noted that many people in the courtroom reacted with visible horror and emotion. However, Darren himself showed no reaction whatsoever as the images of destruction and death were displayed. His complete lack of emotional response was striking to those who witnessed it. When Darren took the witness stand in his own defense, he maintained his innocence while admitting to certain aspects of the prosecution's case. He acknowledged he had been present at the family's home, but claimed he had only been there to perform decorating work arranged by his brother Daryl. According to his testimony, he had been tricked into coming and left when he realized Daryl was planning to rob the family. However, he did admit to eating a slice of pizza while there, which could explain how his DNA ended up on the pizza crusts. Darren's stepmother provided testimony that was devastating to his defense. She told the court that both Darren and his van had been missing for a continuous 36-hour period that corresponded exactly with the time the family was being held captive and tortured. She emphasized this extended absence was completely out of character. In the 2 months he had been living in their household, he had never been away for such a long period without explanation. According to her testimony, Darren didn't return home until 6 o'clock in the evening on May 14th. When he finally came home, he immediately got into an argument with his father and complained about being stressed out, though he provided no explanation for where he had been or what had caused his stress. After hearing all the evidence and testimony from both sides, the jury deliberated and ultimately found the 37-year-old Darren guilty on all charges brought against him. These charges included first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, extortion, arson, and theft. The conviction represented a complete victory for the prosecution. During the sentencing phase, the judge imposed the harshest possible punishment available under the law. Darren was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would never be released from prison. Darren attempted to appeal his conviction, filing his appeal in December 2020. However, 2 years later, the D.C. Court of Appeals refused to grant him a new trial and upheld his conviction on all charges. This final legal determination meant his life sentences were now permanent and that he had exhausted his options for challenging the verdict. To this day, no one other than Darren has ever been charged in connection with the murders, despite ongoing speculation about possible accomplices. Darren himself has never provided any additional information about the crimes or named anyone else who might have been involved, maintaining his silence even after his conviction and sentencing. The physical destruction of the original mansion was completed in 2017 when the remaining structure was torn down entirely. In its place, a new mansion was constructed, though the location will forever be remembered for the horrific crimes that occurred there. Nearly a decade after the murders, the impact continues to reverberate through the lives of all those touched by this tragedy. Savas, Amy, Vera, and Philip had been held captive and systematically tortured for almost 19 hours, and the full extent of their suffering may never be completely known. The surviving family members continue to live with the psychological aftermath of these events. Daughters Abigail and Katerina, Vera's husband Bernardo and their children, longtime housekeeper Nellie, assistant Jordan, and Savas's employees are all haunted by endless cycles of wondering whether they could have somehow known what was happening, whether they should have recognized warning signs, or whether different decisions might have saved the lives of their loved ones. These thoughts create an endless loop of guilt, grief, and second-guessing that may never fully resolve. The knowledge that their loved ones endured hours of torture and terror before their deaths adds an additional layer of anguish that will remain with the survivors for the rest of their lives. Everyone loves the excitement of preparing for a baby shower. The decorations, the gifts, the anticipation of welcoming a new life. It's one of the most joyous moments for any family. Friends and loved ones gathered, waiting for the expectant mother to arrive. But instead of balloons and laughter, they were met with horror. Her apartment had been stripped bare, her dresser, her clothes, her furniture, all gone, like someone was erasing her from existence. This wasn't decades ago, it happened in 2017 in Baltimore. A young woman, 22 years old, 8 months pregnant, vanished without a trace. And the dark truth of what happened next is more grotesque and disturbing than anyone could imagine. This is the case of Akia Eggleston. Akia was the kind of person who brought joy wherever she went. Those who knew her described her as someone with a warm heart, always ready to help anyone in need. She had a passion for dancing and loved expressing herself through various forms of art. Her world centered around her close family, especially her stepfather, aunt, and grandmother, who would become her main sources of support. During that particular May, Akia found herself depending on her family more than usual. She was 8 months into what doctors had labeled as a high-risk pregnancy, all while raising her 2-year-old daughter, Emery, on her own. The burden of these responsibilities felt even heavier because Akia was still dealing with the grief of losing her mother, who had died from breast cancer just 2 years before. The loss of her mother had created a deep emptiness in Akia's life. After her mother's death, Akia seemed to change. She became more quiet and kept more to herself than she used to. The one thing that still brought her comfort was volunteering and staying connected with her community. However, even these activities became harder to manage as her second pregnancy progressed. Since Akia's pregnancy was considered high risk, her doctor had given her strict instructions to get plenty of rest. This meant she couldn't drive, take long walks, or do anything too physically demanding. Despite these restrictions, Akia seemed to have found a solution to her situation. At the time, she was in a relationship with Michael Robertson, a 35-year-old man who was the father of her unborn baby. They were making plans to move into a new home together before the baby arrived. They had already chosen a name for their son, Anubis. Akia and Michael's connection went back many years. In fact, Michael's grandmother had been Akia's babysitter when she was a child, so their families had known each other for a long time. The two had reconnected in the middle of 2016 when they ran into each other at a mutual friend's birthday party. Soon after that meeting, they started dating. After Akia became pregnant, they began planning their future together. This was something that made Akia genuinely happy and excited. On May 3, 2017, Akia went to the bank and withdrew money to pay for a deposit on their new apartment. For days later, on May 7th, she had organized a beautiful baby shower for herself. Akia had planned every detail of the baby shower herself. She had spent nearly $1,000 on the location and decorations. But as time passed and the appetizers were served, something very important was missing from the baby shower Akia herself: the expectant mother. Everyone knew that Akia was 8 months pregnant, and those closest to her knew that her pregnancy was considered high risk. Naturally, everyone's first thought was that maybe she was at the hospital dealing with some complication, or perhaps she had already gone into labor. The problem was that Akia wasn't answering her phone as everyone was arriving at her party. So the family decided to call Stefan, one of Akia's closest friends in the world. He was supposed to pick Akia up that day and drive her to her own baby shower, since she wasn't allowed to drive herself due to her medical restrictions. Since Akia's family knew about this arrangement, they contacted Stefan to ask if he and Akia were together. Stefan told them no. Akia had said she would call him when she was ready to be picked up, but he hadn't heard from her that day. He had simply assumed she was running late. That's when Stefan and several other party guests decided to rush over to Akia's apartment to check on her. When they arrived at her place, there was no sign of Akia anywhere. Even more strange, many of her belongings were missing. It wasn't just small items like money and jewelry. Heavy pieces of furniture had been removed from the apartment. Her dresser was gone, and most of her clothes had been taken from her closet. This was clearly something that Akia couldn't have done by herself, especially being 8 months pregnant. At this point, the family called 911 and then went to the police station to file a missing person report. That same day, police visited Akia's apartment, but they didn't find any significant evidence. To them, it simply looked like someone was in the process of moving out of the apartment. Meanwhile, the family searched the park near Akia's home, hoping to find her or some sign of what had happened to her, but they found nothing. Once it was confirmed that Akia wasn't at any of the local hospitals, the police began working to piece together a timeline of what might have happened, because now they had an 8 months pregnant mother who was missing. The police discovered that Akia, who was very active on social media, hadn't posted anything online since May 3rd. This meant that 4 whole days had passed between Akia's last online activity and when she failed to appear at her baby shower. Her family found this silence particularly odd because Akia had been regularly sharing updates about her pregnancy with her followers on social media. Her final post on the afternoon of May 3rd showed a picture of her latest sonogram. When the investigation officially began and officers started interviewing everyone who knew her, they discovered they were already 4 days behind. 4 days might not seem like a long time under normal circumstances, but when someone goes missing, especially a pregnant woman, every hour that passes makes the situation more serious and the chances of a positive outcome much lower. Security footage from May 3rd showed Akia at a local bank, where she had gone to withdraw money for the deposit on her new apartment. The cameras captured the 4'1" woman wearing a green t-shirt and black sweatpants. A friend had provided transportation for her that day, driving her to the bank and then dropping her back off at her apartment sometime between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. This timing matched up with cell phone tower data, which showed that one of the last signals from Akia's phone came from a tower located near that same bank. But after that point, it was as if Akia had simply vanished without leaving any trace behind. Following May 3rd, there were no more posts on social media, no more Facebook messages sent to friends, no more trips to the bank, and no more cell phone activity of any kind. What made the situation even more frightening was that the investigation continued for weeks and months, with police and family members searching everywhere they could think of. But Akia's due date came and went without any sign of her. The authorities had no leads, no evidence pointing to where she might have gone, and no clues about what could have happened to both her and her unborn son. The situation was made even more tragic by the fact that there was a 2-year-old little girl, Emery, who was left wondering what had happened to her mother. Despite the urgency of the situation, it took some time before police brought in the one person they probably should have questioned right away, Akia's boyfriend, and the father of her unborn child, 35-year-old Michael Robertson. To be fair to the investigators, Michael wasn't making himself easy to find or interview. According to official police statements, Michael had developed a pattern of avoiding contact with law enforcement, sometimes disappearing for weeks or even months between interviews. Since the police didn't have grounds to arrest him, they needed his cooperation to conduct proper interrogations, which made the investigation much more challenging. When detectives finally managed to get Michael to sit down for a formal interview on June 15th, a full month after Akia's disappearance, he told them something slightly different from what he had originally told her family. He claimed that the last time he had seen Akia was on May 1st, which was 2 days before she was last seen by anyone else. Michael's story to the police was that he had stopped by Akia's apartment that day, left to go to work, and when he returned later, he found all of his belongings packed up in a box. According to Michael, he didn't interpret this as a sign that they were preparing to move in together as they had planned. Instead, he saw it as Akia's way of telling him that she was ending their relationship and wanted him out of her life. Beyond this basic account, Michael didn't provide investigators with much useful information to help with their search for Akia. However, by July 2017, the police had become fairly confident that something criminal had happened to Akia. They strongly suspected that Michael Robertson might have been involved, especially after they discovered several suspicious facts about his behavior and background. One particularly troubling detail was that Michael had gotten a completely new phone and phone number just 1 day before Akia's baby shower was scheduled to take place. Even more shocking was the discovery that Michael had been living an entirely double life, maintaining a secret relationship with another family while he was supposedly planning a future with Akia. It turned out that 35-year-old Michael was simultaneously involved with another 22-year-old woman named Haley, and they had children together as well. The timeline of these relationships was particularly disturbing. Haley had given birth to her second child with Michael in August of 2016, and then just 1 month later, Akia became pregnant with Michael's child. This meant that Michael had gotten another woman pregnant almost immediately after Haley had just given birth to their second baby together. The logistics of maintaining these two separate relationships and families seemed almost impossible to manage, yet somehow Michael had been juggling both situations simultaneously. While it's unclear whether Haley initially knew about Akia's existence, it appears that Akia was at least somewhat aware of Haley and Michael's other children. However, the exact details of what Michael had told each woman about the other remains uncertain. He might have simply told Akia that Haley was an ex-girlfriend with whom he shared custody of children, without revealing that they were still actively involved. What is known is that around April 2017, just a few months before Akia disappeared, Michael and Haley had been evicted from the apartment they shared together. This eviction was what led to Michael staying at Akia's place on a more regular basis. When questioned by detectives, Michael claimed that he wasn't even certain whether Akia's unborn baby was actually his child. He said he had been under the impression that their relationship was open and non-exclusive, so he felt a paternity test would be necessary once the baby was born. He told investigators that if the test proved he was the father, then he would be willing to step up and take responsibility for the child. However, Michael also acknowledged that Akia herself was completely convinced that he was the father of her baby. According to his account, problems in their relationship began when Akia started asking him to accompany her to doctor's appointments and ultrasound visits. When he refused these requests, saying he wanted to wait for paternity test results first, arguments between them started to increase in frequency and intensity. Michael claimed that when he returned to Akia's apartment and saw all his belongings packed up, he waited around for her to come home so they could discuss what was happening between them. According to his version of events, Akia never returned home that evening. Based on this experience, he concluded that their relationship was truly over, which explained why he didn't attend the baby shower and why he hadn't tried to contact her afterward. Michael insisted to the police that he was genuinely concerned about Akia's well-being and completely denied having any involvement in her disappearance. However, When investigators pressed him about who else might be responsible, he pointed them toward someone he claimed to be suspicious of: Akia's best friend, Stefan. Stefan was the same person who had been assigned to pick Akia up and drive her to the baby shower. But Michael painted a very different picture of Stefan's relationship with Akia. According to Michael, Stefan's feelings for Akia went far beyond normal friendship boundaries. He described Stefan as being completely obsessed with her. Michael told investigators that Stefan would drop everything whenever Akia needed something. If she needed transportation somewhere, Stefan would immediately make himself available. If she was short on rent money, Stefan would offer to lend her cash without asking any questions. This level of devotion, according to Michael, suggested that Stefan's feelings were much deeper and more intense than typical friendship would warrant. When investigators began looking into Stefan, they discovered that the two friends were indeed extremely close. Akia trusted Stefan enough to give him the passwords to her Gmail and Facebook accounts, and she had even given him a key to her apartment. This level of access and trust was unusual even for close friends. The investigation into Stefan revealed another concerning detail: he owned a gun. This discovery prompted police to bring him in for formal questioning. During the interview, Stefan told investigators something that immediately raised red flags and made him appear even more suspicious. Stefan explained that a day or two before the baby shower was scheduled to take place, he had made arrangements to meet with Akia because he was planning to loan her $200. When she didn't contact him about this planned meeting, he became worried about her well-being and decided to use his key to check on her at her apartment. According to Stefan, when he entered Akia's apartment, he noticed that many of her belongings were missing. Her clothes were gone. The new crib she had bought for the baby was no longer there, and he even observed several holes in the walls of the apartment. The timing of Stefan's discovery was particularly troubling. This meant that days before the baby shower, when the rest of Akia's family discovered the disturbing state of her apartment and realized she was missing, Stefan had already seen clear evidence that something was wrong. Despite discovering that Akia wasn't answering his calls and that her apartment showed signs of a hasty departure, Stefan never reported her missing to the police. Even more suspicious was Stefan's behavior on the day of the baby shower itself. When Akia's family called him asking whether he had picked her up for the party, Stefan simply said he was still waiting to hear from her. He never mentioned that he had already been to her apartment, seen that her belongings were gone, and been unable to reach her for days. When investigators asked Stefan directly whether he and Akia had ever been romantically involved, his answer was evasive. He said they had sort of dated, but claimed it hadn't lasted very long. However, when police examined the Facebook messages between Stefan and Akia, they discovered intimate conversations that strongly suggested the two had been sleeping together, possibly on and off for an extended period. The digital evidence painted a clear picture of the dynamics between them. Stefan appeared to have deep romantic feelings for Akia, while she seemed to view their relationship as more casual, essentially a friends with benefits arrangement. This imbalance in their feelings provided what investigators considered a possible motive for a crime of passion. The revelation about Stefan's unrequited feelings also made Michael's insistence on a paternity test seem more reasonable. If Akia was involved with multiple men around the time she became pregnant, Michael's uncertainty about the baby's parentage became more understandable. Investigators confronted Stefan with the obvious question: why hadn't he called police immediately when he couldn't reach Akia and discovered her apartment in such a strange condition? Stefan's explanation was that he hadn't found the situation alarming enough to involve law enforcement right away. He said he had decided to wait until the baby shower to see if he heard from her, knowing that she would never miss such an important event. Despite the suspicious circumstances, Stefan had been very cooperative with the investigation from the beginning. He had even been posting messages on social media about trying to find Akia, writing emotionally charged statements like, "If I have to move mountains or take a life, I will find you." With Stefan apparently cleared, investigators turned their attention to a new person of interest, someone who had very good reason to dislike Akia if she knew about her existence. This was Michael's other girlfriend, Haley Pomeroy. Haley and Michael already had 2 children together, and while Akia seemed to know about Haley's existence, it was unclear how much Haley initially knew about Akia. When investigators looked into this angle, they discovered that Haley's reaction to learning about Michael's relationship with Akia had been explosive. Haley was described by people who knew her as having a volatile personality, and she had clearly been furious about Michael's affair. She had been posting angry messages on Facebook, calling Akia a home wrecker and expressing her rage about the situation. When police brought Haley in for questioning, she didn't try to hide her feelings about Akia. She openly admitted that her feelings were hurt and that she hated Akia for interfering in her relationship with Michael. However, she insisted that despite her anger, she would never actually hurt anyone. Throughout the entire interview, Haley maintained her innocence and denied any involvement in Akia's disappearance. Police obtained a subpoena for her phone records to verify her claims, and the digital evidence seemed to support her version of events. There was nothing in her phone data that connected her to Akia's disappearance. With both Stefan and Haley apparently cleared as suspects, the investigation found itself back where it had started, with no clear leads and no obvious perpetrator. As 2017 continued, months passed without any new developments in Akia's case. Frustrated by the lack of progress, her family decided to take matters into their own hands. They began reaching out to various media outlets, hoping to make Akia's story more public and perhaps pressure local law enforcement to prioritize her case more actively. Despite their efforts to contact multiple news organizations, the family found that no one seemed interested in covering Akia's story. One outlet even told them directly that her case wasn't considered newsworthy enough to warrant their attention. Faced with this rejection from mainstream media, the family reached out to the Black and Missing Foundation, a nonprofit organization specifically dedicated to bringing more awareness to missing persons of color. With the foundation's help, the family was finally able to start spreading the word about Akia's disappearance. For months after she had vanished, Akia's story finally began gaining traction. By September of 2017, news of her disappearance was being reported throughout Baltimore, and eventually the story gained national attention. People were finally talking about Akia and demanding answers for her family. The increased media coverage had the desired effect. In November of that year, the FBI finally joined the investigation. The Baltimore field office even offered a reward of $25,000 to anyone who could provide valuable information about Akia's whereabouts. Despite the increased attention and resources, the case remained baffling. It seemed almost impossible that someone could simply disappear so completely, especially in an urban area where there are typically many potential witnesses and security cameras. Around this same time, an intriguing clue emerged that would add another layer of mystery to the case. That fall, a group of Akia's family members and friends had gathered in front of her apartment building to hold a vigil and prayer circle for her and her unborn baby. As they were cleaning up after the emotional gathering and preparing to leave, one of Akia's friends noticed something unusual in the shrubs near the front door of her apartment building. Hidden in the bushes was Akia's debit card. What made this discovery particularly strange was the condition of the card. Despite the fact that it should have been sitting outside in the weather for months if it had been there since Akia disappeared, the debit card appeared to be in remarkably good condition, almost as if it were brand new. While the debit card discovery didn't provide any major breakthrough in solving the case, it served as another strange piece of evidence that strengthened investigators' belief that someone had deliberately harmed Akia. The circumstances strongly suggested that whoever was responsible was likely someone from her inner circle, someone she knew and trusted. With this in mind, police decided to focus their attention on what they considered their strongest evidence: Akia's cell phone data. The digital trail from her phone would prove to be crucial in building their case. After careful analysis of the cell phone records, investigators became confident that whatever happened to Akia occurred around 5:22 in the evening on May 3rd. They were able to pinpoint the specific time because Akia had been actively engaged in a social media conversation, and then suddenly all activity stopped completely. At this exact time, Stefan's alibi cleared him completely as a suspect. The investigation also revealed that Haley had been with her mother that evening, receiving help with caring for her 2 children. This left investigators with only one person whose whereabouts couldn't be confirmed at that critical moment: Michael Robertson, the father of Akia's unborn child and their original primary suspect. As detectives focused more intensively on Michael's activities during this time frame, his story began falling apart in numerous ways. Several aspects of his behavior immediately following Akia's disappearance had already raised suspicions among investigators. Most notably, Michael had changed his cell phone number just 3 days after Akia vanished. He had also refused to participate in any of the search efforts for her, despite the fact that she was carrying his child. While Michael claimed that Akia had broken up with him several days before the baby shower and that he hadn't seen her since then, the people who knew Akia best said this version of events didn't match what they had observed. In fact, just days before the baby shower, Akia had been telling friends how excited she was about moving in with Michael. Furthermore, on May 3rd itself, she had clearly been withdrawing money from the bank specifically to pay the deposit on their shared apartment. When investigators finally obtained Michael's phone records, they discovered that his account of events was completely false. The digital evidence showed that on May 2nd, Michael had sent photographs of apartment interiors to someone, clearly indicating that he and Akia were still actively looking for a place to live together right up until the day she disappeared. Even more damning was what the phone records revealed about May 3rd itself. The last outgoing call from Akia's phone occurred at 3:44 in the afternoon, and it was placed to Michael Robertson. 20 minutes later, at 4 p.m., Michael had taken a ride-sharing service from his location to Akia's apartment. Most significantly, this ride had been ordered using Akia's phone. Michael's cell phone data showed that he remained in the area near Akia's apartment from at least 5:35 p.m. until 6:18 p.m. that day. Later, around 6:57 p.m., something very telling occurred. A telemarketer attempted to call Akia's phone, and at that moment, both Akia's and Michael's phones were located in downtown Baltimore, miles away from her apartment. Immediately after that telemarketer's call came through, Akia's phone was either turned off or disabled completely. This suggested that whoever had possession of her phone realized it was still active when the call came in and quickly shut it off to avoid detection. The phone was never turned back on after that moment. If the cell phone evidence wasn't suspicious enough, investigators discovered something even more incriminating about Michael's activities that evening. After returning home, Michael had conducted multiple internet searches on his home computer that painted a horrifying picture of his intentions. Michael had searched for information about how to dispose of and hide a body. He had also conducted 18 separate searches related to trash collection services, wanting to know where dumpster contents were taken and the locations of various landfills around Baltimore. These internet searches provided investigators with what they believed was clear evidence of Michael's guilt, but they also presented a significant challenge. Despite having substantial digital evidence pointing to Michael's involvement, they lacked the physical evidence that would make their case ironclad. They had no DNA evidence, no confession, and most importantly, no body. However, investigators did develop a theory about what they believed had happened on the afternoon of May 3rd. They theorized that Michael had taken that ride-sharing service to Akia's apartment, possibly with the intention of ending their relationship or telling her that he was choosing to stay with Haley instead. Whatever Michael's original purpose for the visit, investigators believed that it triggered a heated argument between the couple. According to their theory, this confrontation escalated to physical violence, and Michael ended up killing Akia, whether intentionally or accidentally. The investigators theorized that after killing Akia, Michael wrapped her body in a blanket that was later found to be missing from her bed. They believed he then placed her body inside the dresser from her bedroom, the same dresser that Stefan and family members had noticed was gone from her apartment. This theory would explain the holes in the apartment walls that multiple people had observed. Michael would have needed to maneuver the heavy dresser, with Akia's body inside, through the apartment and out of the building. The investigators believed he then placed the dresser, containing Akia's remains, in a nearby dumpster located just 30 feet from her apartment building. Despite having developed this detailed theory and possessing significant circumstantial evidence, the most frustrating aspect of the case was how long it took for law enforcement to act on their suspicions. Years passed without any charges being filed against Michael. It wasn't until February 2022 that investigators finally brought Michael Robertson in for another round of questioning, hoping they might be able to extract a confession from him. During this 2022 interrogation, investigators confronted Michael with evidence they had gathered over the years. They told him they knew he had seen Akia 2 days after he claimed his last contact with her, and they had spoken with the ride-sharing driver who confirmed he had transported Michael to Akia's apartment on the night she disappeared. Faced with this undeniable evidence that he had lied about his whereabouts, Michael finally admitted the truth. He acknowledged that he had indeed seen Akia on the night she vanished and that they had gotten into a serious argument. According to Michael's new version of events, Akia had just gotten out of the shower when she caught him texting Haley. This discovery led to Akia giving Michael an ultimatum. He had to choose between her and Haley. When Michael told her he was choosing Haley, Akia declared that their relationship was over. Michael claimed that this decision caused their argument to become even more intense and heated. However, he continued to insist that nothing physical had occurred between them, repeatedly denying that he had harmed her in any way. While investigators had hoped this interrogation might lead to a full confession to murder, Michael's partial admission still provided them with something valuable. Based on this admission, combined with all the other evidence they had gathered, authorities finally decided they had enough to proceed with charges. The now 41-year-old Michael Robertson was placed under arrest and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for Akia and one for her unborn son, Anubis. Over the years since Akia's disappearance, there had been multiple searches for her body and that of her unborn child. These searches included extensive efforts at a landfill in Northern Virginia, where investigators believed the contents of the dumpster they suspected Michael had used would have been taken. Despite these extensive efforts, neither Akia nor her baby were ever found. The absence of physical remains presented prosecutors with a significant challenge as they prepared for trial. They had no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, and no eyewitnesses to the actual crime. Their case would have to rely entirely on digital evidence from phone records, Michael's suspicious internet searches, and his own admission that he had fought with Akia during what appeared to be their final encounter. However, as the trial proceeded, one piece of evidence emerged as particularly compelling to the jury members. The most convincing element of the prosecution's case turned out to be the cell phone data showing that both Akia's and Michael's phones had left her apartment together and traveled to downtown Baltimore that evening, where Akia's phone was then permanently shut off. This evidence was significant because it made it virtually impossible for Michael to claim that he had simply left Akia alive at her apartment and that someone else had harmed her afterward. If that had been the case, her phone would have remained at the apartment location, not traveled downtown with his phone. During the trial, this was the one piece of evidence for which Michael's defense team couldn't provide a reasonable alternative explanation. Michael himself didn't attempt to offer any justification for why both phones would have moved together and why Akia's phone would have been turned off in downtown Baltimore if he had left her alive and well at her apartment. After 3.5 weeks of testimony from various witnesses and experts, and following 2 days of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom with their verdict. They found Michael Robertson guilty on both counts of first-degree murder, one count for killing Akia and another for killing her unborn son, Anubis. The judge sentenced Michael to 2 consecutive life sentences for his crimes, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison for what he had done to Akia and her baby. Unfortunately, while the guilty verdict provided some measure of justice, it didn't bring the kind of peace or closure that Akia's family had hoped for. The most painful aspect of the entire ordeal remained unchanged. Akia and Anubis's bodies were still missing, somewhere out there without a proper burial. The family had never been able to say their final goodbyes or lay their loved ones to rest with dignity. Putting Michael Robertson behind bars, while important, couldn't undo the fact that Akia and her son had been denied the respectful treatment they deserved in death. Their remains were still lost, leaving a permanent wound in the hearts of those who loved them.